Sometimes they say that the more things change, the more they stay the same. And that's a lot like what we're seeing here in the ERP, AI, technology, and consulting industry here in 2026 as we're recording this podcast episode. There's a lot changing in the world as far as technology. The AI is changing. AI is becoming a big deal. ERP systems are still making that big push to the cloud. You've got supply chain management solutions that are developing and becoming more prominent than ever. And that's the good news. A lot is changing and evolving, getting better from a technical perspective. But the bad news is that the machine, the technology and consulting machine that perpetuates and enables technology transformation, that machine is still fundamentally broken. It's still leading to a disastrous set of results, an alarmingly high failure rate, and it's not bound to get any better. In fact, it's bound to get worse before it gets better. But there's good news in all of this, and that is if you can understand how the machine works, if you can navigate that machine, and you understand how the dysfunction between vendors, consultants, and end customers, if you understand how the dysfunction comes to be and how it leads to a bunch of bad decisions, you can navigate that and make better decisions. And so while I'm not going to suggest that today's episode will allow you to fix the machine, I will suggest to you that today's episode is going to dive into how to navigate the machine to your benefit, especially if you're an end customer. This is really an episode for you to help you and your team, your leadership figure out how to best navigate the unfortunate realities of the machine, but you can turn it to your advantage if you do it right. So that's what we're going to cover here in episode 282 of Transformation Ground Control.
Welcome to Transformation Ground Control. Ground Control. The podcast that covers everything related to digital transformation. Whether you're embarking on an ERP implementation, supply chain transformation, or any other business or digital transformation, this podcast is for you.
3, 2, 1.
Ground control to Major Tom.
Welcome to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 282. I'm excited for today's episode. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting and your host here today. I'm really excited to get into today's topic. A lot of what I'm going to talk about here today is focused on what I talk about in my new book. It's called Welcome to the Machine. And in this book that you can get via Amazon, it ships to you anywhere in the world. You can also get it electronically if you'd prefer, but you can also get it hardcover and paperback. But in that book, I tell a lot of stories about what's broken with this industry and with this machine. And not because I just wanted a soapbox to complain about, but because I wanted to give end customers and even vendors and consultants an inside understanding of how all the dysfunctions and problems in this industry lead to customer failure. The customers are the ones that are paying the price for the dysfunctions of this machine. The vendors and consultants are largely benefiting from the dysfunctions of this machine. And that's really what I want to dive into here today. Now, before we dig into it, there's a couple things I'm gonna get to in here in just a moment. I'm gonna get into some interesting news from Starbucks and how they're shifting their technology spend in a really interesting way. And I think it might be a foreshadowing of what a broader trend might be in the industry. So stick around for that. I'm going to get to that in just a moment. I'm also going to get into a really interesting settlement agreement that SAP has reached with the European Union, the European Commission within the European Union. And even if you're not in the EU, this is huge. I think it's a huge settlement. I think it's very good for customers. You're not going to want to miss it. Even if you're not an SAP customer, I think it sets the tone for what ERP customers can and should demand and expect from their vendors. But we're going to get to that here in just a moment. But today's episode in general, what I want to talk about is the conflicts of interest in the technology industry. And I've been talking about this for a long time. I've always struggled with it. I've always had somewhat of a ethical, moral, existential dilemma or conflict that I felt about this industry. On one hand, I love my job. I love being a consultant. I love helping customers and clients. But on the other hand, I just cannot stand some of the dysfunctions in this industry. And so I'm excited for today's episode because I think that I'm finally getting to a point in my career where I can understand it and accept it for what it is and not be angry about it and not be frustrated by it, but instead look at it for what it is and just accept it as reality and help clients in a way that I think will help make things better. And I also think that by more consultants and vendors hearing about this unintentional dysfunction that exists in our industry, I think that there's an opportunity here for you listening here today. If you're a vendor or consultant, there's an opportunity for you to understand what the implications are to your end customers and understand how you might be better, how we can all step up and provide better solutions and outcomes to our customers. So for years now, though, I've been the guy warning about conflicts of interest in the tech industry, and I get a lot of heat for it. A lot of times people will give me a little grief about being too negative at times. I got it a lot more earlier in my career. I don't get it as much lately. I don't know if it's because people are just used to it and they know that I'm going to complain either way, or if they perhaps there's more people that recognize it for what it is. But either way, there is something shifting in the industry, and I think this industry is going to be okay longer term. It might take some more pain. It might take some more regulation to get it to be okay, but I think eventually it will be. And I think this industry could be a force for good rather than a force for destruction, which I would argue it is too often in today's day and age. It's too disruptive. It's too destructive. The end goal that we're all aiming for is good and well-intentioned, but there's a path of chaos and destruction that gets left behind, and the customers are usually the ones that feel the brunt of that. So the reason I think it's changing, though, is because the EU and UK are actively investigating anti-competitive behavior by major ERP vendors, including SAP and Oracle. They're looking at whether their practices are actually harming customers. They're looking at potential anti-competitive behavior, which, I'm not a big fan of government regulation. I know the EU can get overzealous at times in their regulatory approaches and their penalties that they impose on tech companies like Microsoft and Google have had, been the targets of past investigations and settlement agreements and, data privacy laws that we all, for better or for worse, have to deal with now. That all originated in the EU. And so, I get it. There's a subset of people here that might say, well, we don't need more government regulation. But in this case, I do think it might be helpful, because I think the EU and UK investigating this potential anti-competitive behavior of ERP vendors, I think it opens the eyes of the entire industry. It should open the eyes of the entire industry, and especially end customers and buyers. I think end customers and buyers should just know what they're up against and what they're dealing with. I think that alone makes it worth the fact that the EU is looking into this. And what they're looking into and what they've been looking into is whether their practices are actually harming customers through restrictive licensing, forced migration, and new API policies that lock third-party AI tools out of customers' own data. And so what used to be dismissed as Eric's just being cynical, or Eric's just on a soapbox complaining about the industry that he's part of, now it's the subject of formal regulatory scrutiny. And I think the good news is the machine is finally getting looked at. It's getting a spotlight put on it, which I think long-term is going to be a very positive thing for buyers. Now, I would submit to the tech industry, vendors and consultants, that I would suggest that we get our act together and start acting more ethically so that we don't get regulated, because the more we continue with these antics that have driven and fueled high profitability and growth for the tech industry for decades now, those same antics are, I feel like we're running out of runway here, and it's going to get regulated if we don't do something about it. I had a professor in university when I was getting my master's degree. I got my MBA, master's in business. And one of my professors, I still remember this really well, is one of the most insightful quotes that has stuck with me, 30 years later. And I remember him saying, it was a business law and ethics class. So we would study law, but we'd also study ethics, the intangible, fuzzy, gray area of ethics. And I remember him saying that the best way to avoid regulation and to get out of regulation is to not give regulators a reason to regulate you. So if you start doing shady stuff, you're going to get regulator involvement. In fact, if we as an industry were in a business to consumer space, not B2B, I think we would have been regulated 30 or 40 years ago. I don't think this would have gone on for this long. But because we're a B2B, no one really feels bad for or cares about, a big global company getting screwed. Maybe they do care, but the regulators are more concerned about the little guys, the little end consumers that don't have leverage. And that's, obviously not the role government plays. But anyway, that's a long way of saying that if we don't regulate ourselves, someone is going to step in and regulate it for us. And I want to share with you this update with SAP. And SAP had been late last year, they were under investigation by the EU. The EU is looking into third-party maintenance and support, and whether or not SAP was essentially making it more difficult for customers to opt into third-party maintenance and support. In fact, I submitted a briefing. I wrote a 15-page briefing of my opinion of the structure of the market, and the EU opened it up for public comment. Even though I'm not a member of the EU. Many of our clients are. We do business in the EU. We see a lot of companies that are harmed by some of the tactics of SAP and other big ERP vendors. So I submitted a 15-page briefing to the EU, just basically giving my opinion of what I think the flaws are in this industry. And I don't know how much they read it, if they read it, if that factored into this at all. I'm sure other people commented as well. But just a few days ago, earlier this month, the EU announced that SAP had agreed to some binding commitments. And what's really interesting, again, if you're not in the EU, still pay attention here, because this is really important. And even if you're not an SAP customer, this is really important. This is important for any enterprise technology buyer, because I think it sets the tone for what we can all expect as customers, what we should be expecting from our vendors and consultants. So what they're doing here is they're saying that now customers, or now SAP is going to allow customers, SAP landscape to be split into separate parts. So they'll allow to choose different maintenance and support providers for different levels of support for SAP, or none for each part. So they're making it easier for customers to pick and choose when and how they use, or if they use third-party support. They're not being forced into SAP support or being strong-armed into using only SAP support. They also will allow, this is really interesting. I like this a lot, actually, because I've always thought that one of the disadvantages of cloud contracts and long-term support and maintenance contracts is that regardless of your business performance, you're still locked into whatever cost you agreed to. And that, I always thought that was a bit weird. You know, if you sign up for like a bunch of cloud subscriptions today, but you have to downsize in the future, like with AI or macroeconomic trends, something may cause you to need to downsize your company, say 20% in the future. We hope it doesn't happen, but it could. At that point, you're still locked into that high cost structure based on what you were today. Now, I think ERP vendors assume you're just going to keep growing, you're going to keep consuming more and more, but there's the opposite effect that really does happen. And I've always thought it was strange that ERP vendors, especially cloud vendors now, have their customers locked in, and they're going to guarantee, vendors will be guaranteed to get paid by struggling companies and customers because of the contractual arrangement and because of the importance of an ERP system in any customer's operation. So in other words, it's a lot easier to maybe not pay other vendors, but you're going to pay your ERP vendor because you don't want access shut off. Anyway, that's for cloud systems, but for support and maintenance, which is a little bit different, the EU and SAP have agreed that customers can terminate their licenses and their maintenance and support fees in the following scenarios. So for products that are in the final maintenance and support stage in which SAP provides reduced services. And this is where Rimini Street and Spinnaker support and companies like that are really pushing into SAP's space, or SAP's turf, if you call it. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but they're giving SAP a run for their money, and they're giving SAP competition in third-party maintenance and support, especially for customers that are still using ECC, and that's their legacy product. That legacy product is going to be it's going to have declining support between 2027 and 2030, to where eventually they'll have no support available from SAP. And so what Rimini Street, Spinnaker, and others are doing is they're providing third-party support options at a lower cost, knowing that SAP is reducing their level of support because they're discontinuing that product. So in the past, it's been difficult to get out of those contracts. And in many cases, SAP was penalizing their customers who terminated contracts. If they decide to come back to SAP for support and maintenance in the future, they were back charging those customers that had gone to third-party support. They back charged what they would have paid SAP, which is completely bizarre to me, but that's just, I guess, the way SAP works sometimes. So the good news is now they've agreed to stop doing that, at least in the EU. But again, even if you're not in the EU, I would just look to this and say, this is what I expect too. I don't care that your settlement is only binding in the EU. I want that same thing. I would use this as a playbook of negotiation with SAP and other ERP vendors. They also say that they can terminate their licensees and maintenance and support in the case of workforce reduction. If there's a workforce reduction of 10% or more over the course of 10 years, they can reduce their licensees accordingly, which I think makes complete sense, and I'm glad they're doing that. They also can cancel in the case of insolvency or bankruptcy, which that's huge too. Why would your ERP vendor have priority over other creditors and other suppliers you work with? And the reality is they probably shouldn't, but they do because they have such leverage and such a stronghold on your operations, and it's hard not to pay them because they can shut off your access to your entire operations. They also have a carve out here. This last point is they have a carve out for divestitures. So if a company sells part of their business, the customers will be able to transfer the licenses to the buyer. They can transfer part of the license to the buyer and terminate the remainder, or terminate all of the licenses if the buyer doesn't need SAP software. So that's huge. And then there's a lot of M&A activity, a lot of private equity and M&A acquisitive companies will acquire companies and then get stuck and saddled with these big bloated contracts with SAP or your ERP vendor. So this gives them a way out. So I think those are the major points. And like I said, this all started in 2025, in September 2025. They started this investigation, and usually when the EU starts an investigation, they're trying to get some sort of concession from the provider so they don't have to go to court and all that stuff. So good news, SAP doesn't have to go to court. SAP's customers, I think, are the big winners here. I think it's pretty cool that they're doing this, and I think it's a good thing. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think this will change things for SAP customers? Do you think this makes things better? Do you think this will help non-SAP customers outside the EU and SAP customers outside the EU as well? I would love to hear if you think this is a good thing or what your thoughts are in general. Another thing I want to talk about here today before we dive into stories from the machine, and these essentially are stories from the machine that we're getting to here, but this is really interesting. I think this is a sign of things to come in the enterprise tech space, and that is something that Starbucks just announced a few days ago. They essentially said that they are going to, I'll just read you the summary here. They're disrupting the enterprise software market by developing their own AI-assisted tools to replace Microsoft and IBM systems, aiming to cut its $400 million annual software spend. This move is driven by AI-assisted development, making in-house solutions more viable. It caused software stocks to dip, signal the shift in the long-held build versus buy paradigm for large corporations. The strategy emphasizes fixing underlying business processes before applying AI, a lesson learned from past failures. The author of this article recommends that business leaders do 4 things. Consider building internal AI tools, watch the new services economy emerge around process redesign, and ensure data ownership remains a business. And this signals a focus on diligent process work. So essentially what this is doing, and what they're doing is they're saying we're not going to overinvest in commercial off-the-shelf software from these big vendors like Microsoft and IBM. Instead, we're going to develop more of this ourselves. Now, this comes on the heels of a Starbucks having a pretty significant AI failure, where they actually just pulled the plug on an AI rollout in North America across 11,000 stores. They had an AI inventory management tool that was supposed to count inventory for store clerks within each of the Starbucks. It failed miserably. It couldn't keep track of inventory. It mislabeled stuff. It was just a disaster. And so they totally pulled the plug after spending however much money on it. Now that happens. Now part 2 of that is now they're saying, hey, we're actually going to just start building our own tools. And I don't know, I can't remember the vendor that created that AI tool for them that failed, but I imagine that probably partially played into this, saying, hey, look, these third-party vendors aren't giving us what we need. We're spending a ton of money. $400 million on IT is a ton of money, even for a company the size of Starbucks. And they are struggling as a company. I think they're struggling to find their footing of growth and reigniting their growth. So $400 million to them is actually a really big deal, because they are struggling to continue that growth they've had over the years. So makes a lot of sense. And the fact that you can build your own stuff in-house and do it a lot easier and faster and cheaper than you could in the past, and the fact that more of these big vendors are moving to more vanilla, homogeneous sorts of solutions that are highly scalable for them, for the vendors in a SaaS or cloud environment. I think that's obsolete. I don't think that model is going to last. And I think Starbucks is firing a warning shot to the industry, which I stole that from the headline. It's not like that was my term to fire a warning shot. That was from the headline of this article, but they are firing a warning shot. And I see it the same way, that they're saying, hey, look, we don't need to be spending this much money with you for these alleged best practice off-the-shelf systems when we can build our own, something that's unique to us. And by the way, it's our own IP. They don't talk in this article about intellectual property, but I've been talking a lot about this lately, about how intellectual property, competitive advantage, those are all things that companies don't focus enough on, and they don't realize how much they're unknowingly giving up those competitive advantages and intellectual properties by going to these vanilla cloud systems. And what I see Starbucks doing is saying, we are going to take back some of that control. And I think this is a very healthy move, and I think that's where the rest of the industry is going to go. But I'd love to hear from you. What do you think? This whole build versus buy debate is a big one. It's controversial. Very strong opinions out there. I'm sure many of you have strong opinions, so I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about this build versus buy thing that Starbucks is navigating? Do you think that's a trend of things to come? Is it a blip? Is it an exception to the norm? Do you think more companies will start to build versus buy? And also, do you think that more companies might look at more of a hybrid model? Maybe there's some stuff that remains more vanilla in the cloud, and there might be some stuff that becomes more custom, more custom developed type stuff. So love to hear your feedback on that. But we're going to dive into our conversation here in just a moment, which the real conversation I want to get to here today is about the machine and stories from inside the machine. And I want to share with you some of the stories from my book. And again, my book is called Welcome to the Machine. I'm going to share some of the stories from in here. I'm going to take audience stories as well. I want to hear your questions and some of the stories you've experienced. And really the whole purpose of today's conversation is going to be to understand how this machine was built and how it creates systemic breakdowns and failure points for customers. And I want to explain what you can do to navigate that, especially if you're an end customer. If you're a vendor or consulting, you'll want to hear it too, because you'll want to know how a lot of the work we all do in this industry is unknowingly and unintentionally, in most cases, in my opinion, contributing to customer failures, and customers are paying the price for the dysfunctions of this industry. So we want to get into that here today. We're going to dive into that here in just a moment. Before I take a quick break, though, I also want to remind you that we have our flagship annual event coming up in September 9th through 11th in Denver, Colorado. We're hosting Digital Stratosphere 2026. It's 3 days of no spin, vendor neutral conversations on ERP, AI, and digital transformation. I'm keynoting. I'll be signing copies of that same book that I'm going to be talking about here today, Welcome to the Machine, available on Amazon. You can find it there. You can also buy it when you get to the conference, and I'll sign it for you, or bring it to the conference. I'll sign it for you. But go to stratosphere2026.com. Check it out. You can learn. You can see the agenda there, the topics we're going to cover. A lot of great speakers there. Some new ones that we haven't had before, some repeat ones that have been here in the past. Some of these speakers are amazing. And I invite them back multiple times because they're so good. People like Jan Bond, who founded Bond Software and is the founder of other tech companies. Marcus Harris, who's a software attorney. Scott Bickey, who's a research analyst at Infotech. Emma Roloff, who talks a lot about people and change, the people side of change. A lot of different speakers are going to be there. That's just a small handful, a small sampling of who will be there. But check out the full agenda. You can learn more about the different passes and registration options at stratosphere2026.com. You can attend in person, which is ideal, or if you can't attend in person, if you're international or just can't make it for whatever reason, you can register to attend virtually as well. You'll get access to the live streams as well as the recordings after the fact. Just go to stratosphere2026.com. Be sure to use the promo code EARLYBIRD20 to get 20% off. So tickets are limited, and we'll dive into our conversation here in just a moment. But first, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
I'm Greg Benton. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer with Third Stage Consulting. And if you are embarking on your digital transformation journey or in the middle of that journey in 2026, you're going to want to see our digital transformation report. This latest edition really dives into a lot of the key trends that we're seeing in the marketplace and the ecosystem right now. It also highlights a number of the things that are happening with AI being an important component and integral part of the ERP systems that are leading the way right now. Also, the shift toward composable and best-of-breed cloud solutions is really accelerating the decline of monolithic ERP replacement. The opportunity to download the report is found at thirdstage-consulting.com. And you'll also find other tools that will help you in the initiatives and the business planning that you're doing for 2026. Don't leave Phase Zero without it. Reach out today.
I want to encourage you to read our Guide to Organizational Change Management. It's a free report or a free guide that we published. It's one that I actually wrote that talks about best practices and lessons learned as it relates to change management. So as you know, on this podcast, we cover a lot of stuff related to the human sides of change, organizational change management, including training, communications, org design, all kinds of stuff as it relates to change management. So if you're trying to learn more about change management, or you're looking for more direction and ideas on how to get started on your change management strategy and your overall journey, be sure to check out this guide. You can read it by scanning the QR code on the screen in front of you, or in the links below for this particular podcast episode. You can find a link to take you to the page that'll allow you to register to go ahead and download that and read it for free. So be sure to check it out. It's the Guide to Organizational Change Management, written by yours truly. I hope you enjoy it. Let me know what you think, and hope you enjoy the rest of this episode. Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 282. My name's Eric Kimberling. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday at transformationgroundcontrol.com. And this is the podcast that covers everything that's tech agnostic related to people, process, technology, strategy, everything you need to know to make your digital transformation successful. And excited for today's episode. We're going to talk about the machine, stories from the machine. I'm going to share with you some of the stories I talk about in my new book called Welcome to the Machine. You can order it on Amazon. There's a link below. I'm going to pop up a QR code here in just a minute that you can scan to get access to that book. It ships anywhere in the world, hardcover, paperback, and or electronically. Also, audiobook too. I almost forgot. That's my first book available on audiobook. And soon it's forthcoming in physical bookstores as well throughout the world. So keep an eye out for that. But in the meantime, you can get it on Amazon anywhere in the world. And in this book, I talk a lot about the dysfunction between vendors, consultants, and end customers. And each of them have their own organizational dysfunctions, and systemic breakdowns between those three parties cause failures. It's no one person's fault. It's easy to point fingers and blame. And a lot of the work I do is expert witness work and project recovery work, where inevitably there's blame, there's finger pointing. But really, if you really step back and look at it, it's a problem with the machine, the system, not the software system, but the system, the industry's system, the way it was built, the way the industry sells software and services, the way that there are inherent conflicts of interest in the model and in the system. And the system is really good at selling software and services, but it's horrendous at delivering any sort of positive outcome for customers. In fact, the failure rates being so high, at over 70 to 80% in most studies, with that high of a failure rate, you have to wonder, how are there so many profitable tech and consulting companies out there when customers are failing at such an alarmingly high rate? And those are just the self-reported failures, by the way. I imagine the failure rates are actually higher than that, but we'll call it 70 to 80% to be generous, still very high. So in this book, I'm gonna share some of the stories. I'm gonna get to some audience questions, and I want to hear some of your stories as well.
And what I really want to hone in on here today are the systemic breakdowns that cause failure. These are things that are not incidental. They're not accidental. It's not luck of the draw. It's not haphazard in any way. It's the predictable output of a machine that's designed to sell software, bill hours, and go live on schedule, regardless of organizational and operational readiness. And that really, if I had to summarize the machine, that is it. The technology machine is designed to sell software, bill hours, go live on schedule, regardless of readiness. And not only that, but the definition of technical success versus business and operational success are two very, very wildly different things. And those differing definitions of success are oftentimes what also contribute to failure too. So it's amazing to me how often I'll see on a client's website, on a vendor's website, a case study or a success story where they talk about one of their clients that did brilliant things with this new technology. But I also know that same client failed miserably in their implementation, but they bought a bunch of software, they went live with it, and they're using a bunch of the software. It just didn't go well. It was a very messy process. It cost more than expected. They couldn't ship product when they first went live, but eventually it became a success. And a lot of times vendors will use those as success stories, but they don't tell you all the failure that happened along the way and all the pain that went with that. So, and if you look at the failure rates of ERP implementations, it's hovered anywhere from, it depends on what study you look at, but it's anywhere from 70 to 80% plus over the last 30 years. It really hasn't budged. I see it actually increasing with AI, the use of AI. I think that's actually increasing failure rates because it's AI is adding a sense of chaos or lack of structure, if you will, to a lot of these projects that already are lacking enough structure. They don't need another tool or another way to make things even more complicated, but yet that's what AI is doing. And that is causing a lot of trouble with companies that are trying to implement AI. And in fact, if you just look at two recent examples, are Starbucks and Ford. two very big American companies that have failed miserably in their AI efforts. Starbucks pulled the plug completely on their AI efforts because it just wasn't working as far as inventory management and helping them manage individual stores. And then Ford actually had to hire back 350 engineers that they had laid off as a result of a quality AI tool that they thought would replace those engineers. They hired back the engineers to come fix all the problems that AI caused. So two just anecdotal case studies, but I think that's indicative and reflective of what's happening in the marketplace right now. New technology, we're all excited about it. We're blinded by this cool technology, and yet we're still failing over and over again a majority of the time. So that's what we're going to talk about. Is that what I want to talk about today is how every failure has a story behind it. There's usually a victim, a villain, and a lesson. But the twist is that the villain is usually the system itself, not the system and the software, but the overall system of technology, the technology industry. That is the villain. It's not any one person. And it, when I say the technology industry is the villain, I don't mean that it's a bunch of bad people that are trying to screw their clients or make them less successful. But what I am saying is that it's not built for customer success. This industry was built for everything but customer success. If you look at who's successful in these projects, there are certain parties that are guaranteed success in every single digital transformation, and that is software vendor, system integrator, and consultants. They will always come out ahead. The customer, 80% or more of the time, comes out harmed. The projects fail, they can't ship product, can't close the books. A lot of times the technologists and the vendors are long gone and they think they've declared victory. They've gone on to the next project, but they haven't stayed behind to see the mess that has been left behind. And so that's the real disconnect, is a lot of times vendors and technologists and consultants don't even realize what a disaster they've left behind because they're gone. They're not there living with the results. They'll go off telling their next client how great things were and what an awesome job they did, but yet that same client that they're citing as a victory oftentimes is anything but that. So I've spent my entire my entire career inside of the machine, for better or for worse. I'm not sure if that's a good thing or not. Sometimes I think, sometimes I'm very happy about that. Sometimes I wonder why the hell I'm in this industry, but I do enjoy it. And the book that I mentioned here, Welcome to the Machine, QR code's right above you here. You can find that on Amazon. That book I wrote to sort of expose the machine, explain how it works, not to suggest that we can change it, because we can't change it anytime soon, certainly not overnight. But if we understand how the machine works, there are ways that we can overcome that. So if you don't mind just dropping in the chat any questions or stories you have, I'd love to share your stories as well. Also, just let me know where you're joining from today. I know several of you already told me my audio was screwed up and I was on mute. So if you don't mind, also let me know what city and country you're joining from today. I always love to hear where you're joining from. Same with you over here on TikTok, which I'm watching here on my phone. Just let me know where you're joining from. Love to hear where you're all at here today. So let's jump into it then. I'm going to share a couple of my own stories here. These are just, like I said, anecdotal stories that I think reflect what's wrong with the machine. And one of my favorite stories to tell is one of my first projects. It was actually my very first project at PwC. And I was just out of grad school. I just finished my MBA. I had a little bit of experience. I had been an intern, an operations and supply chain improvement intern as part of an Oracle implementation for about 2 years prior to joining PwC. As while I was getting my MBA, I did this internship, which is actually a very good internship as a manufacturing company, and learned a ton from it. The CIO had gone to the same university as me, and so he wanted to hire an intern from that school to do some supply chain improvement, and he hired me to do it. So it was really cool because I got to learn a lot about manufacturing, supply chain management. I also learned about ERP technology and how consultants work. And I worked side by side with a lot of those consultants. So at a very young age, I was part of the machine, unknowingly and unwillingly in some ways. But the first real moment of concern I had in my career was this first project I had where, and I talk about this extensively in the book. I talk about it in a lot more detail, this and some of the other stories I'll share with you today. But in this project, we were hired. I don't remember the exact fees that were paid by the client, but it was somewhere between $1 and $1.5 million in US dollars for an objective ERP evaluation. And so it was a Fortune 500 company. They came to us and said, hey, we've got all these manual processes and inefficiencies, and our technology is outdated. We want to upgrade it. It's the same kind of story you hear today. It's nothing new, nothing unique about the problem statement. But what was unique was they hired our team to come in and do an assessment. And we knew from day one that the recommendation was going to be SAP. And this was shocking to me. It actually completely shocked me. It didn't make any sense to me. It still doesn't make sense to me. I mean, it does make sense to me now, but it doesn't make sense to me that more clients and buyers aren't aware of this. But when I went into that first project, I remember asking the question of like, well, what technologies are we going to look at? You know, because I was thinking Bond was a big deal at the time. Oracle was emerging as a pretty viable solution. JD Edwards was a big deal back then. This is in the late 90s, just to give you some context. So the ERP landscape looked a little bit different than now, but still wondered, you know, what kind of systems are we going to look at? And I remember the looks on the faces of this more senior team when I asked the question, like, you know, what kind of dumb question is this kid asking? Why is he asking what systems are we looking at? Of course, we're here to recommend SAP, and that's what I was told. Is SAP is the recommendation. We have to justify and validate SAP. And so we spent probably, I think it was about 6 months doing a complete assessment. And of course, our recommendation was SAP. The client went on to implement SAP. But the bias, you know, I think that taught me at a early age, in an early point in my career, the bias is engineered into the process before you see a demo. And the reason that we were so biased for SAP was twofold. One is because we made money from SAP whenever we would recommend and sell SAP, but also we had a huge bench. You know, we worked side by side with the SAP practice based out of Denver, or at least the practice at the time out of Denver had a very large SAP practice. And so our job, we were different from that practice, but our job was to go in and recommend SAP and then pass that work off to the SAP practice, who would then come in with their army of SAP consultants to come in and do the implementation. So that's, I mean, it makes sense, but it doesn't make sense all at the same time, if you see what I mean. So the economic self-interest was so powerful that it didn't really matter. I hate to say it, it didn't matter what the customer needs were. It didn't matter if SAP was the right fit or not. That's what we were going to recommend.
So first, let me define what I mean by the machine, because it's key to everything else I'm going to say today. So the machine is the self-reinforcing system of software vendors, system integrators, and consultants that are engineered to sell software, bill hours, and go live on schedule, regardless of whether or not the customer is actually ready and whether or not they're actually getting business results and business outcomes from that transformation on the customer side. But here's the critical part. The machine isn't a group of bad people. And honestly, it's taken me a while to figure this out. It's not, there's no like central body somewhere in some part of the world hidden behind locked doors trying to decide how to make things difficult for customers and how to maximize profit at the customer's expense. I don't believe that at all. I also don't think that there's a bunch of bad people in this industry. I think there's actually very smart, well-intentioned people that are trying to do good work. And the problem isn't with the people, it's with the incentives. And I see this all the time now. In fact, even when I'm debating with, having a healthy, constructive debate with someone on social media or whatever, and it's someone who works for a vendor or works within a certain ecosystem, I have to look at it from the perspective of, well, that person's paid by the vendor. I mean, their job is to drink the Kool-Aid. Their job is to perpetuate the message, to have confidence in that message, and to represent their company. So in some ways, they're actually being really good people. They're doing their jobs. They're being good employees. They're doing what they're told is right by their superiors or their companies or employers. But in order to understand where the problem lies, you have to follow the money. The software vendor wins when you buy software. That's fair enough. They need to make money. That's their job, is to sell software. It's not a bad thing, but they win when you buy software. The system integrator wins when they bill the hours. The consultant wins when the project drags on. And every one of those people come out ahead whether your project succeeds or fails. And that's the problem. The failure rate is 70 to 80% for 30 years, but the success rate of consultants and vendors making money off of those same customers is probably really close to 100%. And that failure rate that customers experience hasn't budged really at all. Now, here's the part that should stop you cold to think, and that is, who's the one party that isn't guaranteed to win? The only one that's guaranteed not to win and has a high likelihood of not succeeding at all is the customer. You, the customer, absorb almost 100% of the risk and 100% of the cost. And when it goes wrong, the vendors and consultants have usually already declared victory and moved on to the next project. They never even see the mess they left behind. And in many cases, if they do stay behind because the project extends and drags on, they make more money. So they actually benefit at your expense when things go poorly. So it's a very bizarre incentive structure. Again, I don't think it was I don't think it was designed with the intent of leaving customers in the dust, but unintentionally, that is the end result you're left with, because customers have their own blind spots and dysfunctions, and this machine in some ways forces or overpowers customers and their dysfunctions, and that is the machine. You can't opt out of it, but once you understand how it works, you can navigate it, and that's what the rest of this episode and my entire book, Welcome to the Machine, is all about.
There was such blatant and inherent bias in the process that it was, in my opinion, impossible to give the customers what they really want and what they really needed. And so that's why I started an independent tech agnostic consulting firm, which is what Third Stage does. We're not affiliated with software vendors. The reason I did that is because I didn't want vendors paying us. I only wanted customers paying us. And if we had a bias, I wanted to be more focused on customers. And I think that's why, if you do sense a bias in some of my YouTube videos, newsletter articles, even my books, I do have a bias towards customers, what the customer needs are. And some will say, well, you're too focused on the customer. You're not focusing enough on the vendors and what they can provide. I get it. I know the vendors can provide tons of capabilities way beyond what any customer can ingest. But the problem is most of the time, software vendors are not focused on customer outcomes. And this is my opinion. I love to hear if someone disagrees with me, thinks otherwise. I love to hear your feedback, because I know a lot of people do not agree with me when I say that. But I do think this industry is built on self-serving loyalty to software vendor. And if there's a conflict of interest, which there is, usually the vendor wins out, because the vendor is the one that has the longer term impact on a consultancy or on a system integrator, on an industry analyst. So any one customer, yes, they're important to a consultancy, but not nearly as important to the hand that feeds. And the hand that feeds, in most cases, is a software vendor. In some cases, it's multiple software vendors. So that's one story I had, and I'd love to hear from those of you that have been consultants in your career, if you have had any similar experiences. But I want to turn to the audience real quickly and say hello to some people that are joining here and commenting where they're from. Hamad on LinkedIn's joining from Saudi Arabia. Thank you for being here. Oscar joining from Montreal, Canada on LinkedIn. Thanks for being here. Christopher on LinkedIn says he actually just published a few articles on the same subject, how the enterprise data industry has fallen victim to path of dependency, as the economists call it. That sounds very interesting, actually, because I think there is, the more time I spend in this industry, the more I realize that these digital transformation failures are way more organizational psychology and organizational dysfunction than it is any one person. When I used to talk about failures, I used to focus a lot on, well, whose fault is it? Okay, it's the vendor's fault, or it's the consultant's fault. Maybe it's the client's fault. And what you realize is that all three parties have a role to play in success or failure, but the dysfunctions of each of those parties individually, and especially when you put the dysfunctions of those three parties together, it creates a machine of failure. It sells a ton of software. And again, the vendors and the consultants come out ahead. They're very profitable. They grow. They will succeed no matter what happens to your project. When I say you, I mean you, the end customer. And customers are the one that absorb almost 100% of the risk, and certainly the cost as well. So that's what I think is a big problem with the industry. And I'd love to read your articles, Christopher, because I do agree with you. It doesn't apply just to ERP or enterprise technology. It applies to data. It applies to AI. You could be talking about supply chain management solution, HCM, whatever it is. That the machine has been built the same way across different ecosystems. And the reason that is because it works so well. It works really well. I mean, it sells software. And if I'm a vendor, that's probably, if I were going to start a vendor tomorrow, that's probably how I would build my vendor software companies. I would probably get a bunch of consultants in my hip pocket that I'm paying commissions to, and I'm going to create this army of people that are drinking the Kool-Aid, pushing my product, and have this loyalty to me and my product. That's what I would do if I was a vendor. I'm not a vendor. I'm representing clients' interest. And those two things, that conflict of interest is a big deal. No one seems to want to talk about it in this industry. I get a lot of heat for mentioning that word, conflict of interest, but it is something you have to look at. And I think regulators are starting to look at it too. You look at the EU and what's happening in the UK. There's a lot of investigative activity looking at anti-competitive behavior and whether or not some of the actions of some of the software vendors like SAP, like Oracle, if they're actually harming customers. So want to turn to TikTok as well. Live in One says, my favorite Excel guy going live. I assume you're talking about Spreadsheet Guy. Spreadsheet Guy will not be joining us today, but I'm glad you I think that's what you're talking about. Dung Nang Vu on TikTok says, any advice for a fresher or junior in this AI era? I think learning AI and data science is key. I mean, if you can learn how to use AI and how to do it effectively, but also learn some of the softer skills of project management and change management to go with that technical skill set, that's a very powerful combination. And that's the same advice I'd give to you if you ask me about ERP or HCM or any other CRM or any other technology you might be interested in. So that'd be my advice, is try to get a broad, get that deep focus on data science and AI, but also augment it with other soft skills. And I think that makes you super powerful and indestructible in this industry. Tendai from Zimbabwe joining on TikTok. Thanks for joining here today. Tendai, thank you for the heart me. Thanks for sending me the heart me on TikTok as well. And a lot of you joining here on TikTok. So thanks for being here. If you have any questions or any stories you want to tell, I'd love to hear your feedback on it. Dr. Robinson, the one that notified me that my audio is not working and that I made a terrible rookie mistake at the beginning of this podcast. He's joining us from LinkedIn. And then Third Stage asked, what's the biggest transformation mistake you've watched unfold? I'm going to ask the audience that question, actually. What's the biggest mistake you've seen, in terms of like a behavioral thing? I mean, we'll talk about case studies of big, massive failures, but as far as like the root cause of what mistakes were made on a project, if you've got any stories here in the chat, I'd love to hear your thoughts here. And I'll actually come back to that question in a bit. And then Lean on not on TikTok, on LinkedIn, asks for thoughts on this article. I will read it. It talks about, it looks like it's about McKinsey Consulting is now an investment share. I think that might be the article about how partners now are getting comped more in equity and less in revenue. I think I read an article about, I think it was McKinsey that was talking about that, but I will read that article. So thank you for sharing that. And if you're watching on LinkedIn, be sure to check out that article that Lean shares too. But I'd love to hear your stories, anything you've got, any examples you've got to augment what we're talking about here. And Pratik from India, thanks for being here today. So getting back to some stories here, another story I have is this is where it gets really weird in my opinion. And this is actually, I still, to this day, even though it's been almost 30 years, I get really uncomfortable telling this story because I feel like I'm outing myself and something bad that I did, but I was asked to do it. It reminds me of my I don't know if any of you have seen the movie A Few Good Men, but it's my wife's favorite movie, and I've seen that movie probably 20 times because she loves it so much. But in that story, I actually really like the movie because it's with Tom Cruise and Kevin Bacon. It has a star-studded cast. It was from I think it was the early 90s maybe, that movie came out. So it's been out a long time. But what I really like about the movie is the psychology behind it, because the premise of the story is that it's a military story, and some kids that were new recruits in the military were essentially asked by their superiors to go haze a younger rookie incoming, someone who wasn't pulling their weight in the military. And so the superiors sort of gave the green light to go ahead and haze this kid. And the kid ends up dying because they hazed him, and he had I forgot why, he had some sort of medical condition that caused his death in addition to the hazing. And the whole premise of the story was it their fault? They were asked to do it. Their superiors were asked to do it. They were in the military where you don't ask questions. You just do what you're told. And are you at fault? And that's how I feel about this story here, which is, we would strategize. I remember on that same project I was telling you about, the SAP evaluation and recommendation. Once we got into the implementation phase, I stayed and did a lot of the change management, the process work for that same SAP project. And I remember we would have these internal with just PwC, where we would sit in the client's conference room, because we were back then. I remember we all had to be at the client side at 7:45 a.m. We'd all show up together, and there was like 30 of us, and it was a local client here in Denver, and we would all meet in the parking lot, meet in the lobby. Once all 3 of us were there, we check in with our badges and walk in together. It was weird because it was like an army. The army of consultants shows up all at once, and our partner was really about unified team. We're all not equal, but we're all contributing or whatever. And that started with when you show up at 7:45 every morning, and we would never leave at night until the last person was done. So it usually would end up being 8, 9, 10 p.m. at night. And this isn't during training and the right before go live when things get really stressful. I'm not talking about like go live stabilization, things like that, where you're expected to work. You wouldn't be surprised by this. But I'm talking like early in the project. We're in the design phase and we're working 12, 15-hour days and we're billing that time. And I just remember two things. One is I would be done with my work stream, whatever it was, nothing more I could really do for that day. But I would literally sit 2-3 hours and bill that time to the client while waiting for the rest of the team to finish. And when that last person was done, the senior manager on the engagement would say, okay, we're done. Now we can go. And we'd all leave together. It was extremely rare that anyone would leave outside of that, would fall outside of that regimen.
I'm here talking about stories from within the machine of technology and consulting. I've got a lot more to cover. We're going to be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
When the soul of the city was laid to rest, and the night's forgotten.
If you only attend one event this year, make it Digital Stratosphere 2026. It's our annual flagship conference. It's going to be September 9th through 11th in Denver, Colorado, the same location as we held it last year. It's 3 days where digital leaders, ERP practitioners, and transformation experts come together for no-spin, vendor-neutral conversations on ERP, AI, and digital transformation. There's no marketing fluff. There's no pay-to-play sponsorships, just real practitioners sharing real lessons. Go to thirdstage-consulting.com/stratosphere to learn more and register. Tickets are limited, and these always sell out, and I'd love to see you there.
Are you looking for ways to promote your product or service to enterprise technology decision makers and influencers throughout the world, like the ones who listen to this podcast? Major Tom Productions creates media, events, and influencer marketing for B2B technology providers. Our productions are exciting, educational, disruptive, and effective. Most importantly, they create results. Our content is unlike any other in this industry, engaging, influential, and trusted by technology buyers and influencers throughout the world. Each month, our productions reach hundreds of thousands of targeted buyers and decision makers who trust and engage with our honest and tech-agnostic content. With long-tail viral results and engagement with our content, Major Tom Productions provides a way to reach your target market and create awareness, calls to action, and a connection with potential customers. So collaborate with us today. Learn how we can feature your product or service on podcasts such as Transformation Ground Control, Journey to S/4HANA, and Journey to Dynamics 365. We can also feature your brand on our YouTube channel called Digital Transformation with Eric Kimberling, which boasts over 100,000 subscribers and over 2 million video views per year. You can also participate in our in-person events, including our Digital Stratosphere Conference. Contact us today to learn more. We can tailor a marketing campaign that works for you. We look forward to helping more people learn more about and become engaged with your brand.
Back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 282. My name is Eric Kimberling. This is the tech agnostic podcast that covers everything related to digital transformation, including people, process, technology, strategy, and everything else you need to know to make your digital transformation initiative successful. And I'm here today. We're talking about the machine and systems from inside the technology and consulting machine.
That's not the real story, though. The real story behind this is when we would have these meetings in the client conference room. We'd be billing for the time, and we'd be having these meetings about how to strategize the firm, our footprint. How could we do more? How could we expand the scope? How could we get more people on this project? Which isn't, on the surface, you think, okay, that's not a bad thing. That's your job as a consultancy, is to generate revenue, add more value, blah, blah, blah. Got it. But the extreme to which we did this was pretty mind-blowing to me. The fact that we would sit for hours on end in a client's conference room, billing them for all of our time to brainstorm how to get more people on this project. And then when we did find a way to introduce someone, like when I got introduced to the project, I probably had a small handful of hours of work to do per week. I was giving such a narrow piece of work to start, which made sense because I was new. So I don't think the consultancy and the team certainly didn't know who I was, and they didn't trust me enough at that point to give me a ton of work. But They give me a small handful of hours a week, but I was expected to bill at least 60 hours a week on this project. And I was probably at the beginning adding, 5, 6, 7 hours of value a week, but I was billing 10 times that. And it never felt right. I knew what my rate was. I knew the value I was adding, and it just felt I had that imposter syndrome for sure. And so, when you have those sorts of meetings and again, you're not working against your client, but you're doing things that the client's paying for that is going to benefit you and is questionable whether or not the end result is going to benefit your client. To me, that's an ethical line that I crossed. I mean, I was asked to, I did it. I could have quit. I could have said no, but I didn't. I did eventually quit, but for 2 years or so, I did do it. And I think that's a problem with the consulting model, is that it's based on time and materials. It rewards everything except for client success. In fact, you look at how consultancies make more money. They're going to make more money the bigger failure it is. So really, you think about how consultants and vendors win. I mean, they win no matter what. If you go live on time, on budget, and everything goes perfectly, which it never does, but even if it did, they win, right? They were, they helped you get there. You're a reference account. They can cite that victory and that success and use it to sell more services and software. And if you happen to double the budget, or, they need to hire you back or keep you around to fix the mess that you created, you still benefit. And that's a problem. The fact that you're actually you're perversely incentivized to actually harm the client. And I never came across anyone in my career, just to be clear, I don't think I've ever come across anyone who blatantly thought to themselves or said out loud, let's screw this up for the client so we can make more money. I don't think that's where people are coming from. But the fact that the consequences are pretty slim. In fact, you're actually benefiting financially in the short term, at least. Now, long term, yes, it's going to harm you because now you've got credibility issues and your reputation's at stake. But in the short term, you're making a lot more money if your client fails. And to me, that's a pretty broken system. And so to me, that was a big problem too. So that was early in my career. I became jaded very young. It caused me to want to jump to other consultancies. But then I realized this isn't just a PwC problem. It's not just a Big Four problem. It's not just a consulting a big consultancy problem. It's how a lot of consultancies work. Even some of the smaller ones that I worked for and with were in similar situations. Craig on LinkedIn, joining from Hereford, UK. Thanks for joining. It has been a while indeed. It's a blast from the past. Where have you been? I must not be doing the right topics if you haven't been joining in a while, James. You've got to tell me what topics are going to draw you back in more often. But good to see you again. Kidding aside. Shine from Joburg, South Africa on LinkedIn. Thank you for being here. Marcelo from Miami, thank you for being here. And then Marcelo has a good point here. And they have all the insights about how your internal politics work. And that's true. When you're working with these big four consultancies are masters of political navigating, political maneuvering, politicking, playing the internal politics. I mean, they are really good at it. In fact, I hate to say it, I learned a lot. I mean, for better or for worse, some good habits, some bad habits from the Big Four, and from PwC in particular. I mean, we were trained on how to navigate those politics. And again, not in a way that would say, hey, let's navigate the politics to help make this client more successful. But it was always, let's navigate the politics to expand our scope, to get more revenue. And again, there's a fine line here between doing your job to generate revenue. And, it's a capitalist world we live in. That was my job to some degree, was to generate revenue for the consultancy. But the extreme to which we took it, with the lack of accountability and the lack of consequences, that's the part I think is really broken with this machine, this technology machine. And until the model changes, which I don't think it will anytime soon, I hate to say, until that model changes, you've got to figure out, how am I going to navigate and take control of this? Because if you let it happen, if you just let that happen, like at this client I'm telling you about, these first two stories, the client did not ask questions. They didn't ask, like, who is this kid, Eric, just out of college, has no idea what he's doing. He has a couple of years of, intern experience. Okay, great. But he's billing X amount of dollars per hour, billing 60 hours a week to do what? I mean, no one ever asked that question. I was sure someone would. I mean, I was like, I'm going to get called out. I mean, this is only the last, the jig is going to run out in a week or two, but months go by, years go by. And eventually I think I was adding real value. I mean, by the end of the project, I was actually working 60 hours a week. And so it maybe became a non-issue, but it took months. And, even then, even at my peak on that project, you could question, was I worth what I was billing? I don't know. I wouldn't feel comfortable if Third Stage was billing a client like that, with that level of value and that price tag. And we don't do that. And that in some ways, I wonder if I could grow third stage even faster than we have if I would do that, but I'm not going to do it. I don't want to be part of that part of the machine again.
Now, here's something that took me years inside the industry to fully understand, and that is your consultants' incentives are upside down. They make more money when your project goes worse. Now, let me clear about what I'm not saying. I'm not saying the consultants are villains that are scheming to sabotage you and scheming to make sure your project goes over budget and over time. In 25 years, I've never once heard someone say, let's screw the client to make more money. That's generally not how it works. But here's how it actually works. The consulting model is built on time and materials. It means that every hour, every scope expansion, every delay, every phase 2, every phase 3, 4, 5, 6, et cetera, all of it generates more revenue. And so you think about what that means. If your project goes perfectly and finishes early, the consultant makes less money. If it drags on, it doubles in budget, and they have to come back and fix their own mess, they make more money. So I don't know about you, but I have trouble imagining or thinking of another industry where you have that direct of a perverse incentive from customer outcome to the vendors actually supplying the work. I can't think of anything that comes close. But what about you? If you, the audience, can think of something, I don't even know what to compare it to be honest, but I would love to have one. If we had an analogy or something to compare it to, that'd be a good way to illustrate the point better. But I can't think of anything at the moment, but I'd love to hear from you. So the incentives are literally inverted from your own interest. And in the short term, there's almost no penalty for the project going badly. In fact, there's a financial upside or reward. And I live this. I early in my career, I was billing 60 hours a week on a project where I had maybe 6 hours of actual work to do. So I'm billing 10x of the amount of actual value and work that I was doing. And I would sit in the client's conference room billing them the whole time while we strategize how to get more of our people onto the project. And this is all at the same time while I knew there were people on the project that weren't fully utilized, or, I shouldn't say utilized because they were fully utilized in terms of what they were entering on their timesheet and billing to the client, but the actual value and the capacity of those people was not anywhere close to full. And so nobody really thought that we were doing anything wrong. It's just how the machine ran. We had expectations and targets we had to meet, and that we were rewarded when we met them. The client didn't ask questions. They trusted us. And so the machine just kept running. And so what do you do about it? Well, I would like to say that, having been part of the machine for so long and having seen not just as in my own experience inside the machine, but also helping our own clients navigate these same machines and seeing the same things repeat year after year and decade after decade, you have to put guardrails in place. And that's a big part of what we help our clients do, is to put those guardrails in place so that you're in control. You're the one setting the tone and the tempo and the pace. You get an independent advisor whose only incentive is your success. You need someone who makes money from you and only you, not from the vendor. There's too many vendors and consultants out there that are making just tons, enormous, obscene amounts of money from the vendors, to where, of course, their loyalty is going to be to the vendor if they had to choose. And oftentimes they do have to choose. Who's my loyalty really to? Is it to the vendor that I support, the hand that feeds, or is my loyalty to this particular customer that I'm working with right now? If you let the machine run itself, the incentives will quietly work against you the entire time. Now, this ties into a quick video clip I want to show you. This is a YouTube video I did a few years ago, so I'm going to look a lot younger in this video than I do now, but it's still very relevant today. This is probably just 3 or 4 years ago, but in the last 3 or 4 years, as you will see, I've aged significantly in the last 3 or 4 years. I'm not sure why that is. You turn 50 and everything goes to hell. I'm sure some of you can relate to that. But in this video, I talk about the biggest mistakes of CIOs and leaders. So even though I'm talking about some of the deficiencies of consultants and vendors, I also have to call out the end customers themselves, CIOs, leaders within these end customers, because they, in many ways, enable it. They allow this stuff to happen. And it's not just because they're letting the system integrators run the show. That's not their only mistake. There's other mistakes that CIOs oftentimes mistakenly make. And that's why I want to play you this clip. So let's roll this clip and we'll come back to the conversation. One of the common early fatal mistakes that CIOs make is that when they're going through a digital transformation or leading a transformation, they have the mentality that no one ever got fired by hiring insert name here. It could be that they think that choosing a software solution like SAP or Oracle or Microsoft, one of those really well-known brand names, is going to ensure success. Or it could mean that they choose a consulting firm or system integrator that's very well-known, a company like Accenture or Deloitte or KPMG, for example. Those are examples of situations where CIOs think that they're making a safe bet. They're choosing a vendor and or a system integrator that ensures that they won't get fired. And we often hear that exact phrase from CIOs, that no one ever got fired by hiring whoever it is. The only problem is I can name a lot of people that have been fired for choosing any one of those big name vendors. And so the one thing that you need to recognize is that the cachet or the size or the name recognition of a software vendor or a system integrator is largely irrelevant in my mind. I see no direct correlation between levels of success or failure as it relates to size of organization or the established name recognition of those software vendors. So when you're going through your evaluation process and you're determining who the right partners are to work with, it's important that you look well past the name recognition and perceived quality of these different vendors and look to which one is the best cultural and functional fit with what it is you're trying to accomplish as an organization. Another common dynamic we see that leads to failure with CIOs is to defer too much to outside software vendors and consulting partners. Too often, CIOs, largely because they have blind spots or they just aren't 100% comfortable, will defer to what software vendors or consultants might tell them. For example, they might suggest an unrealistic timeline that they stand behind, but the reality is that timeline is largely unrealistic, for example. In this example, the software vendor isn't the one that has to live with the consequences or live with the results. In fact, it's probably going to be the CIO that gets fired when things go wrong because that timeline was never accurate. Or another dynamic we commonly see with CIOs is they start drinking the vendor Kool-Aid. They believe so strongly in the sales pitch from a software vendor that they're willing to bet their careers on it. Or they believe so strongly in buzzwords like best practices or the ease of cloud deployments or the benefits of low-code, no-code software or the automation that artificial intelligence might bring to the table. They believe so strongly in these concepts that they don't really add a dose of reality to it and make it realistic for their organizations. And that commonly will lead to failures in the project, which will then ultimately lead to a failed career for many CIOs. So it's important that you take vendor sales messaging with a grain of salt and that you add your own dose of reality and add your fingerprints to what a transformation might look like for your organization to ensure that it's aligned with your realities and aligned with who it is you're trying to be as an organization going forward. Another fatal mistake that CIOs make, along with other executives from organizations, I might add, is that they treat digital transformations as technology projects. They get enamored by the technology, they get focused on bells and whistles and cool features of new technologies, which is important, but that can't be the only focus. What's more important is a clear understanding of what the business needs are, what it is you're trying to accomplish as an organization, and ultimately how technology is going to help you get there. And this may, by the way, entail cutting scope or ignoring certain cool technologies or certain new advancements that just aren't relevant to your business. Another mistake within this thread is that CIOs don't think a whole lot about the organizational or the human dynamics of a transformation. They think because technology works from a technology perspective, it's likely to work for the business, and this may or may not be true. The best CIOs I've worked with are actually the ones that know the least about technology, but they are the ones that know a lot about operations, they understand the business they work for, and they understand the value and the importance of the human or organizational sides of change. I'll take someone that knows the organizational and operational side of things, but isn't very strong on the technology side. I'll bet my money on that CIO any day versus the one that knows a lot about technology, but doesn't care or focus as much on the operational and organizational side of things. So some of the biggest career failures I've seen from CIOs are the ones that focus too much on technology and not enough on the operational and human aspects of change. Now, the final big mistake that we commonly see CIOs make is a failure to recognize and mitigate business risk during transformation. This sort of gets back to the other point I made about the myopic focus on technology and the failure to focus on organizational and human aspects and operational aspects of change. But it's a little bit different in that it's broader. It's a failure to recognize that there are risks in the project, and it's a failure to understand the magnitude of the risks, and it's a failure to mitigate the risks along the way. I'll give you an example. I had one CIO that I worked with a few years ago that was implementing Oracle in the ERP system. It was Oracle EBS at the time, before the newer versions of Oracle came out. And this CIO had worked with Oracle before at a previous employer, believed strongly in the capabilities and the advantages of working with Oracle, and he sort of downplayed the risks of the Oracle solution. Now, this new company that he was working at now was a highly tenured organization. It was a very blue-collar, well-established organization with people that had been around for a long time, and they were moving off of a very old homegrown system. So he failed on a number of fronts. He failed to recognize the magnitude of that change, going from an old legacy system to a more modern Oracle system. And he failed to recognize the risk of Oracle as a product solution because they were using a product that was so different from Oracle in the past. So he conflated or confused his past experience with Oracle and assumed that his past positive experience with Oracle and the way he managed that implementation would work at this organization, but it didn't. Now, this particular CIO did not get fired, at least not yet, but he did lose a lot of credibility within the organization, and it really slowed down some of his efforts and initiatives that he was pursuing. So these are just a few things to keep in mind as you're navigating your career as a CIO, or if you're an aspiring CIO, these are things to be aware of as you climb up the corporate ladder in your quest to become a CIO. So that was the clip of some of the biggest mistakes that CIOs and leaders make, but I'd love to hear from you. What do you think the biggest mistake is that you've seen one of your end customers make if you're a vendor or consultant, or if you are a team member, or if you're a CIO yourself? What's the biggest mistake you've made or you've seen other peers make? I'd love to hear your feedback in the comments below.
The system is broken. You've got to figure out how to navigate the broken system, because if you don't, if you just let the system happen, if you let the machine take over, you're going to get screwed. You just are. It's just the odds are so far stacked against you that your vendor, your system integrator, your big consultancy, especially if you're working with the big guys, one of the big four, one of the big global system integrators, it's not going to go well. It just won't. It can't unless you put the guardrails in place. If you have someone internally or you hire someone like us that's agnostic and independent, that's the only way to manage that and to ensure that you've got that representation of your best interests and only your best interests. That's what ultimately what you need. And then Marcelo follows up on LinkedIn. That's well said. Drive to revenue over customer successes. And that's very true. And of course, what you do at the end, though, as a consultant, and I see it all the time, is it was really bumpy. It was messy. It cost way more than expected. And somehow you justify it all at the end. You say, well, that was just normal. That's part of the journey. But hey, guess what we got here? And look how great things are. And we're going to go on to the next project. And, you feel good about yourself at that point. But again, being independent and agnostic now, especially where we're the ones that are staying behind with the client to see what's actually happening while the vendor and the system integrator have gone on to the next project, we see what the actual results and impacts are. And there's such a big disconnect between what vendors think they've delivered, what system integrators think they've delivered versus what the business actually got. And that, I think, is a big problem as well. Dad and Sons Collect on TikTok asks three must-have roles on a transformation team and why. Good question. I'd say, first of all, independent advisor, someone who's not on the vendor side, not on the system integrator side, someone who's on your side, who only makes money from you. That's really important because there's a lot of consultancies out there and system integrators that make significant, sometimes a majority of their revenue is coming from vendors. So stop for a second and think about that. If I run a consultancy, and let's just say, and I'll give you an exact number from a big consultancy, and this isn't even one of the big four. This is one of a larger mid-tier SAP consultancy. I know the CEO of this company, and I know that they make 52% of their revenue from SAP, from the subscriptions that they're involved with selling. They're making 52% of their revenue, and their profit, I don't know what their profit is, but it's a lot more than 52% because that 52% is almost pure profit to this consultancy because they don't need extra labor. They don't need more billable hours to generate their revenue. It's just because they sold the software and they're getting this recurring revenue from SAP. So stop and think about that. SAP or whoever software vendor is controlling a majority of your revenue and profit, or at the very least, a significant portion of it. Where does your loyalty lie? When that conflict of interest arises and you have to choose, who are you going to choose if you're a consultancy? And I think it's pretty clear who you're going to choose. And therein lies the problem. And again, the best intentioned people are not going to make good decisions because the money is so powerful to work against that, to work for and in favor of client interest. So back to the question, 3 must-have roles. That would be one, independent consultancy. Secondly, I'd say a really, really good internal program manager, not a project manager, not a technical lead, program manager, someone who can manage all the pieces of different technologies, the change management, the data, the operational process improvements, everything. Someone that has that big picture view That's really important. If you don't have it in-house, you can hire it, you can contract it out to someone like us. But again, that should not be a role filled by your vendor system integrator, because that is a terrible idea. And that's what most companies do. Because again, you've got the fox guarding the hen house the minute you get a vendor or system integrator doing that work for you. So those are two. And I'd say, the third one would be someone who's really good at change management. They don't have to be a change management lead per se. It doesn't need to be a separate team, but it should be someone that's embedded in the core team that's really good at change management and understands the people impact and can navigate the internal politics, the internal biases, dysfunctions, resistance to change, all that stuff. So if I had to pick three, that'd be it. Independent tech advisor, program manager, someone who's really strong in change management. But I looked here, what else? What does everyone else think? Live in One on TikTok says, I think a majority of consultancy base business is like this. Yes, indeed it is, unfortunately. That is a big problem and a big challenge. 6'9" chef on TikTok says, currently moving to S4HANA, but Accenture won't give us access to a sandpit version for training. That's another self-serving problem. This isn't just an Accenture problem. I see it with Deloitte all the time, KPMG, all the big four, all the big consultancies. I think once you start to look at some of the smaller and mid-market SAP providers and other ERP system integrators, you see it less. You still see it a little bit, but not nearly as much as you see with the big consultancies. But the big consultancies, I think what you're touching on here, the fact that they won't give you a sandpit version for training, or they won't let you get your hands dirty, is there's a learned helplessness that, again, the vendor and the system integrator benefits from. So the more you need me, the more you can't live without me, the more you're going to pay me. Right? The more I can withhold information, withhold knowledge, to make you need me and want me more. And it sounds like a super dysfunctional marriage or spousal or partner relationship. And in a lot of ways it is. It's a super toxic relationship, because the more helpless you are, the more I benefit. In a marriage or a relationship, maybe it's your ego. Your ego feels better. In the case of consultants, it's ego, and I make more money the more dependent you are on me. So, and there's also this weird dynamic too in the industry. This might be the biggest trigger for me, is when vendors or consultants think it's their project. Like, this is my project. This just, the customer is being a pain in the ass. The customer thinks they want this, and that. They're not listening to best practice. The software does blah, blah, blah. Software is amazing. I know what best practices are. Client won't listen. And to me, that type of consultant needs to go, in my opinion. Get them out the door. You can't get them out the door fast enough. And that's how a lot of these big consultancies think. I remember doing that at PwC. And I see it all the time now with our clients. You get partners and senior managers, these super high level people that have moved up the ranks in these big consultancies, and they will gaslight you into thinking you're wrong. Like, you don't know your business. We know your business. We work with all these other companies, and we've implemented the software a million times. You're just part of the problem. Just stay out of the way. Let us do our thing. And it's amazing to me how many leaders will say, okay, that sounds good. Because in some ways that's the easy answer if you're a leader too. That's I hate to say it, it's a lazy answer. It's a lazy solution. Just let someone else do it for me. And unfortunately, for any leaders listening, you can't outsource that. If you want this to be successful, you will not be successful if you outsource stuff like that to your vendor and system integrator. You have to get your hands dirty. You have to get involved. And so that's why one of the biggest battles we fight for our clients is to give them control, is to give them access to that sandpit, get them trained in SAP. Like, let's get your people trained in SAP. Let's send them to an independent third-party training that isn't dependent on SAP or your system integrator or whoever your ERP vendor is or your system integrator is. And so that, I think, is where a lot of companies or a lot of teams fall short, and they fail their organizations in that they create and they enable this learned helplessness. They're part of creating this toxic relationship between themselves and consultancy and vendors. And so that's my opinion. I'm sticking with it on. That's probably why Accenture won't give you access to the sandpit version for training, because technically speaking, it's cloud, right? How many times have you heard how easy it is to access the cloud, and we can flip a switch overnight and you can have it? Well, there's a reason they're not giving you access to it. It's not a technical issue. They may say it is. They probably will say it is, if I'm guessing. They're probably going to say, well, there's a technical issue or there's a security issue. They love saying that too, SAP and some of these larger firms. It's a security issue. We can't because of security reasons. It's almost like a smoke screen. Like, who's going to question security, right? But again, you're the customer. You're the one that will live with the consequences. Make the decisions. I mean, you might make some bad decisions along the way. That's okay. But at least you own them, and at least you're not getting gaslit into bad decisions that are probably way off base. So, let me get to some questions here. There's a ton of questions here on LinkedIn. Shine on LinkedIn says, isn't this the main challenge from companies now in AI doing management consulting work internally versus external consultants, and bang for buck? Would be cool to honestly scope against it, but it's chicken and egg philosophy in that you don't know what to do. You don't know what to do when you start, is how the full question goes there. And I think that is true. And I think you're hitting an important, again, an organizational dysfunction. It's no one's fault. It's just, it's a weak spot of most organizations. Most of our clients have the same weak spot, is they don't know enough to know, like, am I getting taken for a ride? Is this a realistic quote I'm getting from the vendor and system integrator? They don't know enough, or they don't know enough of, like, well, what if we did this ourselves? Or what if we went out and hired a bunch of contractors to do the work? Of course, your system integrator will be like, terrible idea. They don't, they're not going to be certified. They're not going to have the, best practice methodology that we have, blah, 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 blah. Or, you need one throat to choke, blah, blah, blah. They're going to give you every reason why you should only get resources from them. But those are the kinds of questions you should ask. You may not go that route, but you should at least ask yourself, what if we hired some of these competencies in-house? Or what if we went to market and found our own consultants and didn't rely solely on the system integrator? Is that the end of the world? No, it's not. It is to your system integrator, of course. They're not going to like it, and the sky will be falling. They will escalate that to your board immediately, and they've got the political capital oftentimes to do it. But that's why the sooner you can get ahead of this machine, the sooner you can get control of the machine, the better. If you wait until you're halfway through the project and the consultants have weaseled their way in there and worked out all these relationships with your board and convinced your board that they're the greatest thing since sliced bread, it's hard to undo that. But if you stop them in their tracks early on, and if you, more importantly, this isn't about vendors or consultants being bad people. It's about you taking control. I can just easily point the finger at customers who let this happen and say, I understand why vendors and consultants do it, because their end customers let them. So is it, again, is it really their fault? I don't know. You could argue it is, but I could also say it's not their fault, because the customers are letting them. They're creating this opening, this vacuum internally. And so I agree. If you can look at other options and consider the right balance of what the right solution is going to be, I think that can go a long way. Another question here from Pratik on LinkedIn. How should organizations balance speed of implementation with change management and user adoption? Great question. I'd say this is a big challenge, because implementing technology can be done very quickly, for the most part, especially if you don't change the technology. If you adopt clean core, fit to standard, best practices, whatever you want to call it, off the shelf, pre-configured software, it can be deployed very quickly. The problem is it can't be deployed quickly in any sort of way that's going to work for your business. And getting it to work for your business is what takes time. It adds to the cost, to the complexity, to the risk. It adds to the likelihood that you get blamed for the failure. And that's what drives me crazy, is when customers get blamed because they have some sort of business model that is highly effective in many cases, but doesn't fit the software vendor's functionality or their narrative. And somehow that becomes the customer's fault. And that's what I mean by vendors thinking it's their project. It's their, they've got the solution. Why aren't you just using our system the way it was built? And that's where a lot of organizations stumble along the way. So I think that you have to do it. It gets back to taking control and ownership. When you get that initial proposal from your vendor and system integrator, chances are extremely high. When I say extremely high, I mean 90 to 95% plus likely that they have completely underestimated what it's really going to take. And here's the real problem is not only are they underestimating time and money, because they're assuming that change management will be relatively easy. We'll do some training at the end. How hard can it be? Blah, blah, blah. They'll also talk about how, they can implement fast with their accelerators. They also will assume that you're going to make immediate decisions, which never happens. So there's all these things, these assumptions that are very flawed, overly optimistic, that are going to have a material impact on the proposed time and budget that the vendors have given to you. But here's the rub. Let's just say they say it's 18 months. It's going to take us 18 months to do this implementation, but it was never going to take 18 months. It's going to be more like 24 or 30 months, If you don't realize that until you're halfway through the project, 2/3 of the way through the project, this gets back to that conflict of interest again. Now suddenly the vendors have staffed the project as though it's an 18-month project. So they've staffed it at a higher run rate month over month, but now you're going to go from 18 to 24 months. They're not going to save money and stop billing you at 18 months. They're going to keep billing you at that same run rate. In fact, they might actually have to add resources now because you're behind schedule. You didn't hit the timeline. So now we've got to add more people to the project. Again, they're benefiting. They're making money on the fact that they completely underestimated. And so the best leaders I've seen, and I love this move. This is a total power move if you're a leader. And if you're not a leader, be sure to send this segment of the video to your leaders. But one of the best power moves I've seen a leader do is say that timeline isn't realistic for us. We actually want to extend the timeline, not because we want to spend more time and money, because we want to be realistic. We want to address user adoption, change management, process improvement, decision-making, all that stuff. So we're going to assume it's going to take us longer. Maybe it's 24 or 30 months instead of 18. So you, Mr. or Mrs. Vendor, now we need you to throttle back your monthly run rate down to a more reasonable level. And your vendor will not like that because they want to make their money faster. Why would why make in 30 months what I can make in 18 months? That's that economic incentive working against you. That's that conflict of interest I mentioned. So that's a pro move. It's your project. Do what you want and treat these projects. I think the end lesson here for me, and if I could leave an important note to leaders out there, is treat this project like any other capital investment. Treat it like a big factory you're building, or a big acquisition, a company that you're going to acquire that's the same size as you. What kind of due diligence and hands-on involvement would you and your leadership team have in those cases? Apply that same principle to these projects. Don't just assume because it's technology, you don't know, you don't have the answers. You need all the experts to tell you the answers, knowing that the machine is rigged against you. So that would be one of my most important tidbits of advice for leaders out there. All right, I'm going to keep getting into questions here. Let's see. Marcelo had a good follow-up here to Shine's question. He says, good question the perspective they bring to the table. If, as Eric is saying, they're agnostic, based on facts, based on observations, evaluation, and some good critical analysis skills. So again, everything should be based on fact, reality, not this theoretical, what if we had best practices? What if the client would just make decisions faster? What if the client wasn't resistant to change? This is all stuff that is inherent in any company. It's not a bad thing. I'm tired of hearing clients getting blamed for the problem. Now, they do contribute to problems. Don't get me wrong. There are things that, clients are not perfect. Even our own customers, they drive us crazy sometimes, but that's just the reality of a functioning organization. There are dysfunctions within a functioning organization, especially if it's a high growth company, it's changing, going through evolutions, you're going to have dysfunction. And rather than fighting it and blaming for it, you can say that's the reality of it. So let's figure out how to navigate it better instead of presuming we've got all the right answers. Marcelo follows up on LinkedIn with sometimes you have to be honest with yourself and slow down. Very much so. I'd say that's especially true early in a project. Early is when you want to push back and slow down. That minute they get you to sign a contract and they want to send 30 consultants, like the 1998 version of me, where half these consultants don't have any experience or any relevant experience that's going to help you. And by the way, they're good. They're going full speed, right? Their interest is to go full speed to accelerate revenue, accelerate go live, so that revenue, the money machine, kicks in faster. Your job is to make sure your business succeeds. And that, again, conflict of interest, you're going to have to push back on your vendor and system integrator. You just will. If you're taking what they tell you lockstep and barrel, if you're taking it at face value and just going with it, you're doing something severely wrong. That's another tidbit, an absolute truth. If you take that proposal from your vendor and system integrator and that becomes your reality, your line in the sand that you take to the board, that you bet your job on, you are doing it wrong. That's absolutely the wrong answer. You've got to start to challenge and ask questions and modify that to fit your specific situation. And it's one of those deals where, unfortunately, the real answer, the truth, isn't the answer that most people want to hear. 18 months sounds a lot better than a 30-month implementation. If I'm an executive, of course, I'll take that 18-month option. And so if I'm a big four consultancy or big consultancy as a software vendor, I'm going to give that executive what they want to hear. You want 18 months, I'll give you 18 months. I know deep down I'm not going to be able to do it, but hell, I'll try my best. And if, push comes to shove and it turns into 30 months, no harm, no foul. I make more money. We'll get there eventually. How hard can it be? But again, the customers are the ones that pay the price. The customers are the ones that feel the pain here, not the consultants. Here's a good question from Megan on LinkedIn. Were you ever trained or instructed in how to talk to customers or how to shut them up so they would do what you're recommending even when they don't agree? Yes. Great. This is a really good question because I see it all the time now. I think this is why I have an aversion, probably an irrational, I have an irrational aversion and a trigger with industry buzzwords. I think it's because they are designed to play psychological games. And if you think about half of the buzzwords in this industry, they're gaslighting terms. Like they're terms that are meant to either lie, manipulate, or gaslight, or some combination of all the above. So you think about things like best practices. That term, I hate that term, best practice. Sometimes I use it and I physically cringe. Like I'll start twitching and stuff. Maybe not physically, but internally I start cringing, even if I accidentally say the word and it slips out. But the word software best practices, that right there is so misleading. It's so manipulative. I hate to, and again, I'm not saying that there's some Orwellian conspiracy to manipulate customers, but it sells, right? The word best practices sells, and it's what people want to hear. And so we run with it. We double down on that term in this industry. And that's a great example of, I'm going to use terminology like best practices. I'm not just going to tell you, hey, I think you should do things this way. It's not about me. These are best practices. This universal board somewhere defined magical best practices that, by the way, only we have in our software. No one else has these best practices, but only we have access to them. And people buy it because it sounds good, right? Especially executives and leaders that aren't close to the project, they will fall for this and they'll buy it. And so, yes, your choice of words and the way you frame things is very, very important. And that's why there's a series of my attempts to be humorous on Instagram and TikTok. I have a series of videos where I start essentially making fun of consultants. And it's essentially, I play a consultant who's using all the buzzwords and talking like a consultant. I'm using words like holistic and end-to-end business processes and target operating model and all these things that consultants say that make you cringe deep down. I think most people listening, even if you're a consultant, you probably cringe a little bit. If you're a customer, you probably cringe a lot. But those terms, those buzzwords are well engineered. They're not random. Those are well engineered terms that are meant to have a psychological effect to get you to do something. And that something is usually what's in the best interest of vendors and consultants, not necessarily what's in the best interest of customers. So yes.
Now I want to stop for a second and talk more about the language of the machine. Half the buzzwords in this industry aren't descriptions. They're psychological tools designed to get you to do something. So let me just decode a few. And these are a few common ones. I'd love to hear you add to this list as well, but these are a few that come to mind. Best practices, I mentioned, this is a big one. It applies. There's some universal board of experts who define the one right way to do things. And conveniently, only this vendor software has it. And you think about that, it obviously doesn't make any sense. First of all, there's no universal governing board that decides what software best practices are. Even if there were, then why is it just this one vendor that has access to it? Reality is because it doesn't exist. The truth is, best practice usually just means it's the way our software works, or that's the easiest way for us to support it. It's not good or bad. Doesn't mean it's right or wrong. It's just that's the way we built the software. For some reason, we decided to build it that way. It could be based on what we thought customers needed. It's not necessarily what you need, though. And so it's designed to shut down your objections by making you feel like you're resisting expertise itself. So in other words, best practices suggest that you shouldn't really ask questions. It's best practice. How can you argue with best practice? I can't tell you, like, I'm not the one that came up with this best practice. It just is best practice. It's a brilliant term. It's highly effective, but it's a terribly misleading term. And that's just something you want to see through. Another one is technical debt. You think we're all trained to think that debt is bad. You know, you've got a credit card debt. You're paying interest on it. You get penalties. People, you just look at debt. You don't generally look at debt as a good thing. Sometimes corporations do, sometimes they intentionally use debt to fuel growth and to use other people's money to fuel, to finance growth. I would say maybe more technologists that should think like corporate M&A and finance type people, because they don't view debt as bad. They view it as a tool, a mechanism they can use to grow the company. And you could view technical debt as something that you use to reinvest your money elsewhere. Maybe you want to carry that technical debt because you want to go build a new factory, or you want to go acquire a company, and that money might deliver a better result than reducing your technical debt. So technical debt is framed as something that's bad that you need to pay off. And how do you pay off the technical debt? Well, conveniently, I've got an answer for you. You buy new software from me. And it's a phrase engineered to make whatever you already have, the systems you have in place, the customization, the integration points, the whatever you've got, even though it's probably not perfect, it's probably not a terrible thing, but you're meant to feel like it's a liability you're obligated to replace. And you better do it now, by the way. You can't carry that tech debt forward. And you certainly don't want to add to your technical debt by doing more customization or anything like that, even though it could be part of your intellectual property, as we talked about earlier in this episode. Another one, lift and shift. That's another buzzword that makes a massive risky migration sound effortless. You just lift it up and set it down over here. It minimizes the change management, the process work, the data cleanup, and all the stuff that actually determines whether or not you succeed. Another one is clean core. This is one that just drives me crazy and triggers me like nails on a chalkboard. It sounds responsible and hygienic. And what it often means is don't customize, conform to our vanilla software, and give up the differentiation that makes you competitive because you want a clean core, right? You don't want a dirty core. Dirty is bad. Clean is good. You look at the choice of words here is very, very interesting. And I wouldn't be surprised, in all seriousness, if there were some highly paid psychology consultants or marketing consultants that were used to develop these phrases. I have to imagine somewhere some marketing person hired a very brilliant marketing agency of some sort to come up with these terms, because they are just the word clean. There's a lot of other words you could have used, but the word clean is the operative thing here. It's clean. Dirty is bad, clean is good. So the words aren't random. They're well engineered. They work, especially on executives who aren't close to the project. So when you hear them, don't just nod. You want to translate them and ask, what is the word actually trying to get me to do? And who benefits when I do it? And is it really the right answer for me?
I met her in a club down in Old Soho, where you drink champagne and it tastes like Coca-Cola. C-O-L-A.
If you only attend one event this year, make it Digital Stratosphere 2026. It's our annual flagship conference. It's going to be September 9th through 11th in Denver, Colorado, the same location as we held it last year. It's 3 days where digital leaders, ERP practitioners, and transformation experts come together for no-spin, vendor-neutral conversations on ERP, AI, and digital transformation. There's no marketing fluff. There's no pay-to-play sponsorships, just real practitioners sharing real lessons. Go to thirdstage-consulting.com/stratosphere to learn more and register. Tickets are limited, and these always sell out, and I'd love to see you there. Now, this is just one of many mistakes that I think vendors and consultants make. There's a whole list and a whole litany of mistakes I talk about in the book, Welcome to the Machine. In fact, I also put out a YouTube video not too long ago where I talk about some of these vendor and consultant mistakes. Let's roll the clip here, and I'd love to hear what you would add to this list. Perhaps one of the biggest things that vendors and consultants do wrong is that they end up acting as an extension of the software vendor sales channel. Now, to be fair, that's the role and the job of the ERP vendors, to sell you software. But when you also add consultants to the mix who are also being commissioned by and receiving compensation for helping sell and helping implement the vendor solutions, suddenly you have a severe conflict of interest. You have two parties that are making money off selling software, but not making money on a client being successful. So think about this, especially if you're working with an ERP consultant. Your ERP consultant is getting paid by you, the customer, but they're also getting paid by the software vendor. In many cases, the software vendor is paying them more, and they're making more from the software vendor than they make from annual revenue in their overall customer and the services base. And think about that for a second. So with that conflict of interest, whose loyalty are they most loyal to? Especially when the software vendor is the person that is somewhat the hand that feeds. They're feeding them leads, they're helping them with marketing support, they're a long-term relationship, a long-term partnership. Whereas your implementation as a customer might just last 1 or 2 or 3 years, but they've got a long-term loyalty to the software vendor. So you have to look at that in perspective and understand that ERP consultants are too often acting as an extension of selling software, forcing technology where it doesn't always belong, and myopically looking at their solution as the holy grail to solve everyone's problems. Now, what you really want and what you really need to add to the mix is an independent, objective advisor that doesn't get paid by the software vendor. Because the minute you start getting paid by the software vendor, the minute your independence and your objectivity and your client loyalty is compromised. So that's one thing to understand when hiring ERP vendors and consultants, is that their loyalties are conflicted at best, and you need to find a way to neutralize that. There is a big disconnect that often happens between the ERP vendor sales cycle and what actually happens during the implementation. There's often a disconnect between the handoff between sales and delivery, between software vendor and system integrator / consultant, and oftentimes, and more often than not, it's a completely different front-end sales team that's selling the software and the implementation services than what's actually delivering it. And with that comes a number of problems. One is the obvious, which is now we have to re-explain everything that we've explained to the sales reps. We have to bring on and onboard an entirely new team, almost as if we're starting from scratch. The other disconnect here is when you bring on these new delivery resources that are actually responsible for making sure that what happened and was promised during the sales cycle actually gets delivered, there is a disconnect between the expectations and assumptions that were defined during the sales cycle. Oftentimes in the sales cycle, the team that was selling you the software and the services didn't fully understand the complexity of your business. Therefore, the implementation team oftentimes comes in and says, oh, we need a change order 2 months into the project because we didn't fully understand the complexity of your business. And by the way, when you're in sales, your incentive is to sell and to downplay risk, not to be realistic about it. But the implementation delivery team now needs to be responsible for actually managing that risk, and they're the ones that have to bear the consequences of those risks. So the fact that you have bait and switch in sales to delivery is a big deal. But even during delivery, so many consultants are contractors, they're offshore resources, they are very nomadic in terms of being mobile, they move around from job to job. That creates a lot of turmoil and attrition and turnover during implementations, which could be very challenging as well. And then finally, I'll say this about some of the larger system integrators, especially the big four and large global system integrators. They are notorious for bringing in senior partners when the project starts or when they're selling the project, but then having really junior resources and offshore resources actually doing the work, which you may or may not have known when you bought the software and the services in the first place. So bait and switch, that's something to watch out for in the sales cycle and delivery cycles. The trend in the ERP software space is moving aggressively towards standardization, cloud, homogeneous solutions, one-size-fits-all solutions. And the reason for that is not because it's right for the customers, but because it's right for the vendors. They can scale their solutions better, they can make more profit better, they can maintain the software better if everyone would just use the software the way it was built. So what they end up doing is saying, hey, we've got standard business processes, we've got best practices in our software, you should use that rather than however you were doing things before. Now, the reality is a lot of organizations have a lot of intellectual property and competitive advantages tied up in their legacy systems and their spreadsheets and their manual workflows and all the homegrown systems and whatnot, but that doesn't work with the software vendor model. They need you to be standardized so that they can manage one cloud solution, ideally a public cloud or a SaaS multi-tenant model, to where simplicity and vanilla software is the name of the game, makes their jobs easier. Technologically, it makes a lot of sense. But from a business operations perspective, it's highly disruptive and it rarely works. So that is one of the biggest mistakes that ERP consultants and vendors make. And the problem here is that this is a systemic problem. This isn't individual decisions made by individual sales reps or consultants. This is how the system was built. And that's something I talk about in my new book called Welcome to the Machine. I talk about how that machine was built and how it affects customers and how you can navigate that, which is why you should check out that book as well. Software vendors really want you to go live on their software as soon as possible. They start charging you more subscription revenue the faster you do it. They make services faster the sooner you do it. And they lock you into a long-term contract the faster you do it. Sounds good in theory. You may want to do that as well. You may want to implement technology as fast as possible too. But the problem here is that software vendors and consultants are notorious for downplaying, ignoring, or not seeing the actual business risks that are being imposed on your organization. A lot of this is because they're in their own little bubble, their own little world, their own little work stream within an overall program where they're just focused on designing, building, and deploying technology. They don't necessarily care, nor are they compensated, nor are they rewarded differently for the actual end result to the customer, which is why there's so many disconnects between those technical vendors that say, we had a successful go live, but you ask that same customer if it was successful, and they say, no, it wasn't. They delivered the technology, but it completely disrupted our business and we couldn't ship product. And that disconnect is very common. And a big part of the reason for this is because the economic incentive is to protect the cash cow. If I'm making services revenue, I'm making more money the longer it takes you to implement. And if you have change orders and overruns and customization, now all of a sudden I've got an incentive to maybe just let it ride. Maybe just let you go ahead and do some more customization. Take a little extra time. I'm making more money if you take more time, and if you ultimately fail, you're probably going to pay me to clean it up. So there's a perverse, inverted incentive here that vendors often have. And the problem here is that no matter how your project goes, the only two parties that are guaranteed success in financial results are the software vendor and the system integrator. Arguably, the biggest mistake that ERP consultants and ERP vendors make is that they oversell the system integrator as the silver bullet, the one-stop solution that gives you everything you need to make this project successful. We know the technology better than anyone. We've got a project manager. We'll help train some people that can go train your trainers, and we can make it all happen. And that's what we all want to hear. We as leaders want that easy button. We want you to come in and just take this off our plate because it's easier that way, in the short term, that is. Longer term, it makes things a lot more complicated because now those unintended consequences lead to more risk, more disruption, more problems, more myopic focus on technology that completely disregards the business operations and the people side of the equation, which is a lot more important than the technology side of it. So it's important to beware and to be careful of the system integrator, the ERP consultant that says they can do it all. They can manage the entire project because they are just one piece of a broader transformation program, and you need to fill in those other pieces beyond what they are doing on the technology side. So I hope this has given you an understanding of what some of the 5 biggest challenges are and 5 biggest mistakes are that ERP vendors and consultants make, but I'd love to hear from you. What are some of those big challenges you've seen or big mistakes that you've seen your ERP consultant or your ERP vendor make? Or if you are an ERP vendor or consultant, I'd love to hear your feedback on what some of the biggest mistakes are that you and your team might have seen in your career.
So that was my YouTube clip where I talk about vendor and consultant mistakes that are commonly made in a digital transformation. I'd love to hear from you, though. What would you add to that list? Which one resonates the most with you? What's missing? What would you add to that list? Because as is the premise of this entire conversation here today, it's not just clients that are making mistakes. It's also vendor and consultants. And if you're a vendor or consultant, I'd love to hear your feedback as well. What's your take on cloud solutions versus data sovereignty? This is from Carlito on TikTok. My thoughts are, I think, well, the data sovereignty in a lot of ways, it doesn't matter what I think because there's so many government regulations that are dictating how that needs to look that I think that's why so many, we still have a lot of clients that are in government or defense, military defense, or they have some sort of sensitive information that they can't host the cloud solutions outside their country. And so, and that may not be the version of data sovereignty you're talking about. Now, if you're talking about your own data and how to protect it, that's and how to keep it control of it and ownership of it, I think that's a very good question too, because you have to look at your vendor's strategy. You know, does your vendor view the data as yours or do they view it as theirs? And if you ask them the question, I imagine all of them are going to say, oh no, it's your data. But I'm talking about how they act, their policies, the way they let you access the data or don't let you access the data. If they act like it's not yours, then it's essentially not yours. It doesn't matter what they say or what they think. They're acting as though it's not yours to control. And I'll use SAP as an example because they're probably the most blatant in this regard. They have limitations on how you can use your data, what you can or can't integrate that data to. They'll say it's their data, it's for security reasons. That's complete BS. It's a smokescreen. It's a diversion from the real issue is they don't want third-party competition touching their system. You know, they want you to buy everything through SAP. They want to control the ecosystem, and that's a way of doing it. So I think data sovereignty is very important. That's why companies such as Databricks and Snowflake, even Palantir, that's why they're doing so well right now, is because they are shifting the balance of power from core ERP system where you don't have control and it's locked in and you can't necessarily integrate it very easily. They're moving that center of power over to their solutions where it's more focused on integrating between solutions and building workflows across platforms, which isn't a terrible thing. I know some will disagree with me in the tech community, but I don't think that's a terrible thing to have integrated systems that tie across different platforms there. We don't all need to be on the same platform to be successful. So I'm going to get to a couple other stories here, and I'm just going to keep riffing here since I've got time. And if you've got time, feel free to stay with me. Talked about some of my stories, but I want to talk a little bit about some of the client disasters. And in my stories, I talked a little bit about how I would say consultants and system integrators can be so biased and have that conflict of interest. I talked about the software selection that was determined to be an SAP recommendation before the project ever started. I talked about the politicking, the strategizing to figure out how to build the client more and get more people on a project. I talked about not having enough to do, but still being expected to bill full time. In fact, we used to have leaderboards that would float around our office that would each week, there'd be like the top 3 or top 5 of top utilization, which we track, at third stage, we track utilization, right? It's an important metric for consulting because you want to know if you're paying someone a salary, you want to know they're generating revenue for it. So on one hand, I get it, but the competitive nature of it was pretty extreme. And it was highly effective in generating more revenue because we all wanted to be, all of us were, it was a big deal. If you got in that top 3, the partner gave you recognition. It was just a big deal if you would make that top 3. And a lot of times there's the same people that were always in the top 3. And so you're always trying to dismantle the incumbents. But that's just, a cultural thing that, again, it's their prerogative to do, but you as a buying customer, that's not your concern. Your concern is not utilization. Your concern is what value am I getting? So if we look at where clients fail, though, there's some, I'll use some public case studies here because we can't talk about our own clients, nor would I want to talk about our own clients in a negative way. And even if we wanted to, we can't for NDA purposes. So I'll talk about some public failures here and challenges, bad decisions that companies have made. One example is Lidl, which had a $500 million or 500 million euro failure not too long ago involving SAP. And one of the things here, this is an interesting point of contention or debate, and this is a good thing to unpack because I don't think there's a clear answer to this question. But I think the question and the lack of clarity around the answer to it is indicative and a good representation of the types of decisions that every company has to make during an ERP implementation. And that is in many ways, Lidl did not want to change their processes, right? And to an extreme, like there's some things that maybe they shouldn't have changed. There's some things they probably could change. So I'm sure there was a middle ground there somewhere, but they were just, for the most part, digging in their heels saying, hey, the way we operate is the way we operate, and we're not going to change, but we do want to put in S/4HANA to automate the way we operate. Well, that, of course, creates problems. And one of the biggest points of contention, and this is the one that I think is a very debatable, very healthy debate to have, is they had one of the issues with that case, if you haven't followed it, and I have a video on my YouTube channel and a LinkedIn article that dives into this in more detail. Of course, my new book, Welcome to the Jungle, talks about it, or Welcome to the Machine talks about it as well. QR code, upper left corner of my screen here. I'll also include links below if you want to order it. Ships anywhere in the world. But in that book and in other stuff I've put out, I talk about Lidl and how they didn't want to change their costing model. So, and I don't recall the exact specifics. It had something to do with standard pricing versus a different type of pricing, the way they value their inventory, I should say. And so I think it was the way they valued their inventory. Some would argue, well, they should have just changed the way they value their inventory because SAP didn't do it the way they did it, and they didn't want to change it. They thought it was important for them to keep their valuation or their costing model the way they had it. SAP and their system integrator were saying, hey, that's not how it works. This is what we would consider best practice, or this is how the software works. You should do it. And they didn't do it. They tried to change SAP to do something it wasn't built to do, and it ended up failing. So I'm not here to say that Lidl is right or wrong, but I am here to say that every company that implements new technology has to make those decisions. And if they, let's just say if Lidl was right and they shouldn't have changed their pricing model, then they probably should have done something different. They should have either found a third-party bolt-on to address that need. Maybe SAP wasn't the right fit for them. Maybe they needed some custom dev or some way to address that. But whatever the reason is, it caught them by surprise. It derailed the project. It blew the budget out of the water, the timeline out of the water, and it created a lot of problems. So, I don't want to say, again, I frame this as a client's dysfunction, but you could also argue it wasn't a dysfunction. It was a core part of their business. So take it with a grain of salt. I'd love to hear from you. Should Lidl have changed to fit SAP, or should SAP fit to change Lidl?
So I want to dive into this Lidl case study a bit more, this 500 million euro SAP failure. So Lidl, the European grocery retailer, they spent about 500 million euros on an S/4HANA implementation, and ultimately they walked away from it. I think eventually they did end up implementing it, though. To be clear, I believe they ended up re-implementing or going live with it eventually. But at that time, after spending 500 million euros, they pulled the plug, walked away from it. And here's what makes the case worth studying. It's not a simple story of incompetence. It's a genuine strategic dilemma. The core issue came down to how Lidl valued their inventory. Their costing model was different from the way SAP handled it out of the box. SAP and the system integrator said, essentially, change your processes to match the software. That's best practice. And then Lidl said, no, this is core to how we operate and we're keeping it. And then they tried to bend SAP to fit their model. It didn't work and the project failed. So who is right here? I think this is the big dilemma, the big challenge. And here's the honest answer I have, and that is I don't know. And that's exactly the point. This is the decision that every company faces in transformation. You're going to get a lot of I don't knows, but you better figure out how to get to a yes or a no or either or in cases like this, because your way of doing things collide and in many cases conflict with how the software works. And when that happens, you've got three options. You can change your process, you can find a third-party bolt-on that handles it, or you can question whether the software is even the right fit. But what you shouldn't do is what Lidl did, especially for something this big. If it was something minor, if it was a minor workflow or a sort of an edge case over here on the side, then maybe you could have done it. But for something as core and fundamental to their business, to try and change the software, and not only core and fundamental to their business, but core and fundamental to how SAP works, you're trying to change it to be something it's not. And it's not even a matter of is it right or wrong, or is SAP better or worse than what you do. You just shouldn't try to change it to be something it's not. And that's something that probably should have been handled a lot differently. And I don't know what the right answer is. It could have been a third-party bolt-on. It could have been you go with a non-SAP product altogether. It could have been, I don't know. There's a lot of different ways you could navigate it, but the way they did it wasn't right. And so the lesson here isn't that Lidl was dumb. The lesson is identify your non-negotiables, your secret sauce before you start, then architect around them deliberately, because the most expensive way to discover a fit gap is to discover it 500 million euros in and 3 years into the project. And now Lidl is just one example of a failure. Obviously, we're talking about a lot of different failures. One I talk about in the book that we haven't talked about yet in today's conversation is a company called Spar Group out of Africa. They're a retailer out of Africa. They had a big failure with their ERP implementation. And I want to play you this clip as a case study, and just some of the lessons that go with it are very intriguing. So let's roll that clip.
So let's start with an overview of the SAP failure at Spar Group. As I mentioned, Spar Group is an $8 billion company. They do about $8 billion in annual turnover or revenue. They have retail operations, distribution operations, and some manufacturing facilities throughout the world based out of South Africa. And anytime a company like that, who's publicly traded, puts out a financial report and they mention their ERP project in the financial report, it's usually not a good sign. In January of 2025, the company published its financial results for the fiscal year 2024. And in that financial statement, they outlined a number of problems they had with their SAP implementation. First of all, they spent close to $100 million on the implementation, which is a staggering amount for any size company, even an $8 billion company. But what's even more alarming and shocking is that the company lost over $100 million in sales that it directly attributed to its SAP project. So in theory, the project cost not just $100 million, but $200 million in counting. In addition to the problems they had with lost sales, they also have had problems tracking their margins. They haven't been able to track their margins and optimize their margins, which, if you're familiar with the food and the retail industry, margins are very slim. So every tiny little bit of margin that you can get is a big deal. So for a company not be able to manage their important financial controls and the margins behind it, that's a big deal. The other issue that they had is they found that the warehouse management system of SAP didn't fill their needs. And they ended up having to scrap the WMS, or the warehouse management system, and revert to a third-party warehouse management system. So not only was the SAP implementation a disaster, but they had to diversify outside of SAP, which isn't a bad thing, but they found out the expensive and the hard way. And to add insult to injury, the SAP implementation had resulted in a lot of manual processes and actually increased their labor costs. And for those of you thinking about going through an SAP implementation, I'm going to speculate that you're probably doing the SAP implementation in the hopes or the expectation that you'll reduce your manual processes and reduce your labor costs, but that was not the case here with the Spar Group. So that raises the question, what can we take away from this? What lessons are there to be learned? And the good news is that there are some good lessons here, and it's not rocket science. The things I'll share today are not super complicated. It may sound like common sense as I go through these things, but as we'll discuss, and as we've seen in this failure and other failures that we've studied, a lot of organizations and project teams make decisions that don't make a lot of sense at the time, but it's human behavior and organizational behavior that oftentimes leads to some of these decisions. So we'll talk about what those decisions and strategies are that undermine the project, and talk about the things you could do to make your S/4HANA implementation more successful. When we look at the problems and evaluate the issues that Spar Group had in their implementation, it's clear that they didn't spend an adequate amount of time on their current state business processes. Because if they had focused on and understood their current state business processes adequately, they wouldn't have run into the problems they had. Most notably, the fact that they couldn't manage their margins and they couldn't get visibility into what their margins really were, whereas in their old legacy system they could. That tells you that there's a disconnect between the competencies and the processes and the workflows they had built up over time and the actual S4HANA implementation. Now, it's easy to say, well, we don't care about our current state because we want to move to a new technology and we want to adapt to new business processes. That's great. S4HANA can bring new capabilities to you, but there's probably a lot of things you're doing really well, and there's a reason you're doing some of the things you're doing, even if those processes are imperfect, or even if they're manual processes, or even if they could be improved. You still need to understand what they are so you understand the intent of what it is you need S4HANA to do for you. For example, when you look at the warehouse management system and how that warehouse system didn't work for the company and they ended up having to abandon SAP's warehouse management module, it was pretty clear that if they knew what the business processes were in their current state and what they expected to maintain and preserve in those current state processes, they would have known, or they should have known, that the SAP warehouse management system wasn't going to work for them. Same with the pricing analysis and the margin analysis that was so important to the company. The fact that they didn't understand that and bake that into the future state tells you that they either didn't understand the current state or they didn't adequately take that into consideration when they're designing the new system. So just because you're designing a new system and you're trying to define a new future state set of business processes doesn't mean you want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and ignore the processes you have today. And as we'll talk about later in this video, without a current state understanding, your change management efforts are going to suffer as well. In addition to clearly understanding your current state and understanding what's working and what you're doing well in your current state, as well as what you're not doing well and what you want to improve in your current state, now you want to transition into fully defining your future state business processes. And you want to do this before you start implementing S4HANA. It's so common for organizations to say, we bought S4HANA, we know we're moving to S4HANA, let's just get the integrators in here and the technical consultants to come in and start designing and building stuff. Well, that's the wrong answer, because what happens is you're going to rush through decisions, or you're going to slow down decisions and it's going to slow down the project and delay it, or your consultants are going to make those decisions for you, and they're going to make those decisions in a vacuum without consideration of your strategy and what your needs and priorities are. So any one of those three things will happen if you don't do your future state up front. So that's why it's so important that you slow down before you start the project. A lot of companies want to dive in and just get going and start to speed things up, and they think that by skipping the assessment of future state processes and just jumping right into the technology, they think that's actually going to speed things up. And it does speed things up in the short term. It'll feel like you're making a lot more progress than you would otherwise. But what it's going to do inevitably is going to slow things down later in the future, and it's going to create a lot more headwinds and problems and misalignments and mismatches between business processes and technologies. And that's the sort of stuff that derails these projects. That's the sort of stuff that causes budgets to get out of control. And that's the sort of stuff that leads to the problems that Spar Group experienced here, which is not having a clear future state and not having a technology being delivered that addresses those future state business processes and requirements. The other thing that's important with clearly defining future state is that it allows you to create a very clear testing strategy, user acceptance testing. And by doing thorough user acceptance testing with your clearly defined future state processes, you should be exposing these sorts of issues that Spar Group had. So for example, when we look at these pricing and margin issues that they experienced, if they had clearly defined future state business processes and they had user acceptance testing scripts that match up to those future state processes, they would have caught this problem before they ever went live with S4HANA. They didn't catch those problems, so that tells me they probably didn't factor in those future state business processes into their test strategies for the system before they went live. So it's really important that you not only define the future state business processes, but you use those future state processes for user acceptance testing as well as training too. You want to clearly communicate to people and train people on what these new processes look like, and you can't do that unless you have the future state well defined. And I'm going to come back to this whole change management adoption issue here later in the video. When we think of SAP adoption and change management, more often than not, system integrators and SAP as a company and SAP consultants that are out there think of adoption as training. They think about just training people on how to use the new system, communicate to people how to use the new system. But really, this is a digital transformation. This isn't about SAP. It's not about S4HANA. It's about your business and your processes. And SAP just happens to be the provider of technology that enables some of those business processes. So it's really important that we look at the people side of the equation, because we can't enable these new business processes without the people side of the equation being addressed. And the technology becomes worthless if people aren't using the system. And I would argue that no matter how much Spar Group had invested in change management, they were probably still going to fail if they hadn't addressed the other things I talked about earlier in this video. But change management is a way to draw out some of the issues and challenges and kinks in the processes and the technologies that are being deployed. I talked earlier about user acceptance testing and how important it is to base your user acceptance test scripts on your future state business processes that should be well documented. And by involving more people in that user acceptance testing from the business and following those future state business processes as part of their scripts for testing, that usually draws out issues and problems that inevitably happen as part of the design and the build of technology. Now, if Spar Group had invested in change management, that would have been another stopgap or a guardrail to catch some of these problems that they had. So the fact that they didn't catch these problems tells me they probably didn't invest super heavily or effectively in organizational change management. So it's really important to make sure that you invest heavily in change management. You invest in well beyond just training and communications that SAP or their system integrators might provide to you. There's a lot more that needs to happen starting on day one of your implementation, even in the phase 0 implementation planning phase. SAP and S4HANA and some of the sister products that they have are not necessarily going to be the best fit for you. And that's something that Spar Group learned the hard way, especially with their warehouse management system. For a food distribution company where margins and efficiency are so important, and especially at scale for a large $8 billion company, warehouse management is a critical function of their operations and their supply chain. And if S4HANA's warehouse management system can't handle those needs, then it's okay to go out and find a third-party bolt-on that you can integrate with S4HANA. Now, SAP may tell you it's a bad idea, or the system integrator that's aligned with SAP might tell you that's a bad idea, but it's your business and you've got to find the technology that works best for you. And it's not just warehouse management, it's other functions and departments and workflows within your business that you want to make sure are aligned with what SAP can and can't do. And inevitably, you're going to find gaps in S4HANA. You're going to find that there's certain things that it doesn't do well, or it doesn't do the way you want it to or you need it to. And that's okay, but you need to identify that stuff up front before you ever start the implementation so you can figure out a deliberate strategy of how to address that. Because you may decide you want a third-party bolt-on. You may decide you want to customize the software. You may decide that you want to change your business processes to fit the software, and you're okay with that. But whatever the case is, depending on the business process and the areas of gaps between the current state processes and what SAP can do, you want to make sure you have a deliberate strategy for how to address that. And you want to make sure that you've factored those risks and those activities into your implementation plan and budget, because those have a material effect on it. Now, it's easy to think you don't want to bring out the bad news or focus on the negative things as it relates to S4HANA, but every ERP system, every technology is going to have downsides and risks. You just need to understand that up front rather than burying it or ignoring it, because it will come out eventually later in the implementation.
So that was lessons from a case study of an ERP failure at Spar Group. Those are some of the takeaways I've gotten from public information and information I have about the case. But I'd love to hear from you. What do you think the biggest failure points are, not just for Spar Group, but when you look at a customer and the things that they can or should do differently or better, what are some of those things? I'd love to hear your feedback in the comments below.
When the soul of the city was laid to rest, and the night's forgotten.
If you're about to embark on the jungle of digital transformation, check out my new book, Welcome to the Jungle. It's a book that just came out in late 2025. It's my second book, and it's a book that focuses on digital transformation failure case studies and talks about the lessons and takeaways from that. It's 300 pages packed of all the lessons and things that I've learned from having been an expert witness in lawsuits related to digital transformations, and also with our team helping clients recover some of their failed projects. I've included as many lessons as I could possibly fit into one book here. You can read this book. You can order it anywhere in the world in hard copy format, which is this format here. You can get it in paperback. You can also get it electronically as well. Scan the QR code right here or go to the links below for your copy. Hope you enjoy it. Let me know what you think.
Are you looking for ways to promote your product or service to enterprise technology decision makers and influencers throughout the world, like the ones who listen to this podcast? Major Tom Productions creates media, events, and influencer marketing for B2B technology providers. Our productions are exciting, educational, disruptive, and effective. Most importantly, they create results. Our content is unlike any other in this industry, engaging, influential, and trusted by technology buyers and influencers throughout the world. Each month, our productions reach hundreds of thousands of targeted buyers and decision makers who trust and engage with our honest and tech-agnostic content. With long-tail viral results and engagement with our content, Major Tom Productions provides a way to reach your target market and create awareness, calls to action, and a connection with potential customers. So collaborate with us today. Learn how we can feature your product or service on podcasts such as Transformation Ground Control, Journey to S/4HANA, and Journey to Dynamics 365. We can also feature your brand on our YouTube channel called Digital Transformation with Eric Kimberling, which boasts over 100,000 subscribers and over 2 million video views per year. You can also participate in our in-person events, including our Digital Stratosphere Conference. Contact us today to learn more. We can tailor a marketing campaign that works for you. We look forward to helping more people learn more about and become engaged with your brand.
Marcel is giving me some merit cover here on LinkedIn. Says, Eric, don't apologize for that. I'm sticking with it. You're not the only one who's experienced that, where a competing vendor completely creates a codependency or a codependence with the client. So thanks. Thank you. I'm glad I'm not alone. Shine says, great advice. Thank you. Lots of questions. Thank you for all the good questions here. I'm going to come back to TikTok here in a minute too, because I see some coming in here. Here's a question from LinkedIn from Christopher. Christopher says, the big question surrounding digital transformation that no one seems to want to ask is, why would a business that is optimized for its product, market, and personnel need to transform in order to implement software? Why do we still have software that's so difficult to slot an enterprise into? The revenue model you mentioned is more to blame than the capability of the vendors to provide such a system. And I agree. And I think this problem is getting worse. It's something that I've been waving the red flag for quite some time, despite popular disapproval of my comments around this. I'd say if I did say one thing that I believe that I think a majority of the industry disagrees with me on, is probably the fact that cloud systems are overrated. I've said this for 15 years now. I think cloud has a role. It has a purpose. There's value in it in some ways. But in some ways, especially if you double down on cloud solutions, it creates a inflexible trap that's going to be really hard to get out of in the future. And in a world that's demanding, hyper personalization and flexibility and optionality, to see the ERP technology and the enterprise technology space go so far the other way to rigidity, fit to standard, best practice, vanilla, get rid of technical debt, throw out all your old customization. It's going so far, that pendulum swinging so far the other way, it's not going to be sustainable. I'm 100% certain of it. And again, I know a lot of people still disagree with me. They definitely disagreed with me 5 or 10 years ago. I think some more people might agree with me now. But I just don't think it's sustainable. It's just not going to be, especially now with AI, especially with platform as a service. You look at what Salesforce and NetSuite and some other developers of traditional cloud ERP systems are doing. I think they're acknowledging this too, because they're opening up their platforms and their IP. They're opening up their development kits and their development tools to third-party developers to create variations of the software or bolt-ons to handle different needs. Microsoft is another one. They've been doing this from the start with Microsoft Dynamics. So I think these big software vendors that recognize that are the ones that are going to win. I think the ones like SAP and maybe even Oracle with Fusion, I think the ones that push back and double down on this one-size-fits-all generic cloud fit to standard clean core model, that's just not, it's selling software right now, but it's creating so much disruption and pain right now. I just don't think it'll last long. I think 5 to 10 years from now, that'll be a distant memory. But in the meantime, they're still out there peddling this outdated approach that will eventually go away, and they're selling it in the name of eliminating technical debt, which is completely ironic to me, because in my opinion, they are selling more technical debt right now in the form of vendor lock and lack of flexibility and lack of options. So I totally agree with this, that you have to, there are things that every business, the one thing I would disagree with you here on is that every business has some things that they can improve. If they had better technology, if they had a cloud system, they could probably improve some of their processes. They probably tighten things up, get their data cleaned up. So there's some benefit to it. But I do agree that most of the time a company has a secret sauce, a certain way of doing things that isn't resistance to change. In fact, it is resistance to change, but it's a healthy resistance to change. Don't resist changing what works and what has made you extremely successful in your industry, in the name of adopting a software that's very vanilla that your competitor can use in it to lose your competitive advantage. That is just reckless, in my opinion. But yet that's what's being sold by the technology industry in many cases. So thank you for that feedback. Radhika on LinkedIn asks, in your experience, what's the earliest warning sign that a digital transformation project is headed toward failure? I'd say if you are letting the machine run itself without any supervision, that is the biggest sign. And I think that's the real premise of this book, my most recent book. Now, if you look at the books behind me, the Final Countdown, and especially Welcome to the Jungle, I talk a lot about failures and lessons from it, but it's more focused on who did what. Like, here's what a consultant did, or here's what a vendor did. Here's what the end customer did that was a mistake. And here are the lessons you can take away from it, which is fine. It's great. I really like that book. It's my second favorite book after this one. But the reason I like this one is because this one goes a step further and says, well, it's not just about the decisions that were made and who did what. It's why did they do the things they did? And that's what you really have to understand, because rather than casting stones at a consultant or a vendor and say, well, they're the problem, it's like, well, why are they the problem? They're not bad people. Like, even though sometimes people think I don't like big four consultants or I don't like big vendors, people seem to think I hate SAP. I do not hate SAP. I used to be certified in SAP. I built my career on SAP. I see a lot of companies using SAP successfully. So I don't hate SAP, but I do not necessarily like the tactics that are used within the SAP machine or within the broader ERP machine. So that's what I'm calling out. I'm not pissed off at Christian Klein at SAP because he, is leading the strategy or whatever. It's more, he's doing his job. He's navigating the machine in his way. My point is customers have to open their eyes and navigate the machine in the way they need to navigate it. You're going to have tension. It's going to create conflict, and that's okay. But ultimately, you need to win out. You need to stop letting the vendors and the system integrators and the consultants be the only ones that win at your expense, which is what is happening in this industry. So that's, if you see signs of what's in this book, if you see that unfolding unchecked in your business, then I would say that's the biggest warning sign that a project is headed towards failure, because then you're going to start to see all the stuff that I talk about in Welcome to the Jungle. You're going to see all those bad decisions and symptoms arise as a result of that. So good question. Thank you for that. Let me go to TikTok here. Why does Gen AI, this is from Down Come Here on TikTok. Why does Gen AI fail at ABAP versus Python? Is it due to closed source data scarcity? Probably. I'm not a technical expert, but I would say probably. SAP has made it very clear in their actions and their strategy that they only want their own sanctioned tools accessing their products. So their recent API policy that they announced earlier this year is a clear sign that they don't want third-party AI tools accessing their system, their data. I would say it's the customer systems, the customer's data. If a customer wants to use Gen AI to run ABAP scripts or to do some configuration, my opinion is you as a customer should be allowed to do that. SAP thinks otherwise. That's why they're facing so many regulatory scrutinies throughout the world, including in the EU. And I'm sure that'll just continue to accelerate. Why are cloud ERPs inflexible? Are there ones that allow customization? This is from Juan KB on TikTok. And that's a broad generalization. When I say cloud ERPs are inflexible, I'm comparing cloud ERP to the on-prem model. And I know on-premise is a bad word. It's a dirty word. It's not cool at all to say that. It's what an old timer like me would talk about back in the old days when we had on-prem. Well, that's the reality. Companies grew up and built their companies with on-prem. You could do whatever you wanted with it. You could customize the hell out of it for better or for worse. Rather than pointing fingers at customers saying, you're the problem, you customize the software, we should be saying, why did you customize the software? What are we not delivering to you that you need that caused you to customize the software? Or how could we have implemented our technology better to where you didn't feel the need to customize? So it's, in my opinion, that's the real question that should be asked. But as we move to cloud systems just are less flexible, especially if you're moving to a public cloud or a software as a service SaaS solution, because the way the architecture works on those public cloud and SaaS is that you're essentially taking the same software and letting thousands of companies use it the same way. And now the data is still your own data, right? They still siphon or isolate the data, protect the data for you. That's yours, that's unique to you. But the way the software works, the way it looks, it feels, the way it operates is in order for a vendor to scale, to truly profit from this mass subscription model, the SaaS subscription model, they have to have conformity, right? I mean, that's the best way for a vendor to scale, is 100% conformity from their customer base. So that's should be every vendor's dream, is for a customer to be 100% homogenized, because that makes their jobs easier. They can scale at a higher profit. They can grow faster. They can get more people to use the software. The problem is that's not reality. And when I say they should be doing that, it's because that's their job, right? Their job is to make as much money as possible for their company. The way they make as much money as possible for their company is to get you all into a vanilla model. So, and now having said that, there are, like I said, there's Microsoft, there's Salesforce, there's NetSuite, there's some of these other, and there's others too. It's not just these three, but these are the three that come to mind immediately. These are cloud ERP providers that have figured out and recognized that we need to do both. We need to have that mass scale, that common platform that we can scale, but we also need to give edge tools to be able to address all these exceptions and all these industry nuances and unique nuances of different functions. And that's why I really like that strategy that NetSuite, Salesforce, Microsoft, I like the strategy they're pursuing, because they're recognizing that you can do both. Now, whether or not they're doing it well, that's a whole nother story for debate, I suppose. But the general strategy, I think, makes a lot of sense. So cloud ERPs aren't necessarily inflexible. They're just a lot less flexible than they used to be with on-prem. And the ones that allow customization are the three I mentioned, but there's also platforms as a service. So there's platforms you can buy, like Salesforce has their own platform that you can custom dev your own product. You can go through the App Store, and there's thousands of third-party developer apps on the Salesforce platform that integrate with Salesforce. They're still using a common tool set, so it's easier to maintain, and it's not, you're not necessarily adding to your technical debt in the same way you would have in the past. So technical debt, that's another, back to Megan's question earlier, that's another term.
So let me land a point I've been trying to make for 15 years, and it's getting pushed back the whole time. I've been getting pushed back on this point the whole time, and that is that on-prem is not a dirty word, and cloud is not automatically the answer. When I said this 5 or 10 years ago, people looked at me like I was a complete lunatic, and in some ways, maybe I am a complete lunatic, but not for this reason. I don't think this is what makes me a lunatic. I think that it is okay to ask about on-prem. Is there a part of our business that is worth having on-prem? Maybe there's a regulatory reason. Maybe there's a security reason. Maybe there's a competitive advantage or an intellectual property reason. We want all the stuff in-house. That's okay. I mean, that's not a bad thing. It doesn't benefit the vendors, so they're going to tell you it's not okay. The industry analysts, the consultants that are all getting paid by the vendors, they're all going to tell you it's not okay. And so you just have to look outside that echo chamber of financial incentive and look at what's best for you. And so somewhere along the way, the industry decided that if you're not all in on cloud, you're a dinosaur. And if you say the words on-prem in a meeting and you just watch people cringe, I've had people literally call me a boomer on social media because I talk about on-prem. And now, to be clear, I am not a boomer. I'm a Gen X, so I'm at least 5 years from being a boomer. So give credit where credit is due. All you young kids out there that think I'm an old school old timer for talking about on-prem, but I do think on-prem will make a comeback at some point, within reason, within moderation. But the reality is that companies built and grew their businesses with on-prem systems. They could customize it however they needed to. And yes, that led to some really bad decisions around customization, but that doesn't mean you need to throw the whole thing out. Was some of that customization a mess? Sure, but a lot of it was their competitive advantage. And so to take a binary either or approach to something like that is really reckless, in my opinion. To say, hey, we need to throw out that customization, go all in on the cloud. Well, you might be throwing away some customization you never should have had, yes, but you're also probably throwing away some customization that is making you highly effective at what you do. It's helping you beat the competition. Now, if you're in government or you're a nonprofit and you don't care about profitability, okay, maybe that's okay. But for 99% of the world and 99% of the companies we work with, they do care. And there is a reason for them to preserve some of that. So here's the mechanics of why cloud is less flexible, though, because this is a point of contention and a debate as well in the industry. In a public or cloud SaaS model, the vendor takes the same software and lets thousands of companies use it the same way. Your data is still protected, but the way the software works, looks, and operates has to be pretty standardized. And the reason is because 100% conformity is how the vendor scales and maximizes profit. So a fully homogenized customer base is literally the vendor's dream. That's not a criticism. It's their business model, but it's not necessarily your best interest. And that's the way you need to look at it. So let's give credit where credit is due. There's vendors like Salesforce, NetSuite, Microsoft, and others that have figured out you can do both with a common scalable platform, plus edge tools and app ecosystems that let you handle your unique needs. And that's the smart direction. The vendors I worry about are the ones that are doubling down on the rigid one size fits all clean core vanilla cloud, selling it as eliminating technical debt, while in my view, it's actually selling you a new type of technical debt, vendor lock-in and loss of flexibility. And that's something that the industry hates when I say, but all we're doing right now is replacing the old technical debt with a new form of technical debt, which is less flexibility, more vendor lock-in, less control of your own data, less intellectual property, higher costs. I mean, all that stuff, that's technical debt. We are, in some ways, making the old technical debt even worse with just a newer form of technical debt that's even more costly. So that's another reason why I don't like the term technical debt, because eventually everything is going to be technical debt. So it doesn't make sense to criticize it as something new and unique, because every decision we make today is eventually going to be obsolete, and that's okay. But the last thing we want to do is make a decision that makes things even worse. And I worry that a lot of companies are doing that right now. They're making things even worse. They're digging themselves a deeper hole, thinking that they're getting rid of technical debt, but they're in many ways just adding to the technical debt. So my prediction is that the pendulum is going to swing back. The future isn't cloud only. I think it's going to be hybrid. It's going to be fit for purpose, not fit to standard. So I don't think you should let anyone shame you out of asking the real question, which is what should actually live here for my business, and where should the data reside? What parts of my business should be in the cloud? What parts should be on-prem? And what makes the most sense for my business?
Hershey's is another well-cited case study in this industry where they went live with an ERP system right at the time. I think it was either right before Halloween or right before Easter. Is one of the big chocolate buying holidays, and they chose to go live right before that. And to me, that was that mistake, that ownership, that onus falls squarely on Hershey's, in my opinion, based on what I know. They should have known not to go live with a new system right at the peak shipping time. And it was literally at the time. It wasn't at Easter or at Halloween. It was at the time a few months before that, when they needed to be firing on all cylinders, shipping as much product as possible, because they were stocking up for their busiest season of the year. So that is another example where SI, a vendor, may have recommended going live then, but it's a terrible idea. And your job as a customer, as an end client, is to see through terrible ideas and to make them better ideas. And if you're outside advisors, and they will do this at times, they'll give you advice that they think is right, but it's not right for you. You've got to make that tough decision. And this is why I think leaders just need to think more critically. They need to question and challenge. And that's another thing. I think a lot of times when leaders question or challenge, they get gaslit by their vendors into thinking, well, why are you asking questions? We're the experts. And there's a certain amount of arrogance in our industry that I think is very unhealthy. But as a leader, you just need to recognize it's there and ask the questions anyway. The best leaders I've ever worked with are the ones that weren't afraid of hurting anyone's feelings. They weren't mean. They were actually very nice people. But they were very direct. They challenged assumptions. In some cases, they completely openly disagreed with vendors and their consultants. At the end of the day, they had a better relationship too. I think the consultants and the vendors were actually really good in those cases, because they were doing what they're good at. Client is making the decision that's best for them. The whole thing just goes better. It's not perfect, but everyone's happier. Everyone's doing their part to be successful. Whereas if you just defer to the vendor or system integrator, things are going to go off track and everyone's going to be unhappy. Another reason why I don't think vendors or system integrators intentionally do this stuff, but again, being the way the machine is built, it doesn't always put customers' interest first and foremost, as it should. There's also here's another mistake that I think is more on the client's side of things, and this is Queensland Health out of Australia, big healthcare system. They went live knowing that they had over 2,000 known defects in their system, including 14 critical ones. And the internal team ended up agreeing with and downplaying the risk of those showstoppers. So even though they were calling them showstoppers, they thought they could just deal with it after go live. And that's a big mistake too. That's another red flag. If you hear people on your team saying, "Oh, we'll just figure that out in phase 2, or we'll figure that out after go live," your ears should perk up and you should challenge that immediately, because you have to ask, why are we doing that after go live? Why don't we just do it now? Or why don't we defer go live? What's the big deal? If we defer go live, wouldn't that be better? I mean, you should be asking those questions. If you're not, then you're not. You're not managing your vendors. They're managing you. And again, keep in mind, you're the one who has to live with it. They don't. They will benefit no matter what. but you're the one that has to live with the end results here. Another example is Target Canada. This is a disaster. This was a $7 billion mistake. Target Canada, when Target tried to expand into Canada years ago, they tried to bring a new ERP system in, and they had bad data, which completely screwed up the entire operations. And so, one of the lessons here is that when you're doing an ERP implementation, most of the time you have to look at the fine print and the assumptions in the project plan, because usually 99% of the time it assumes that clients shall be responsible for data cleansing and migration. The vendor will usually give you the tools, they'll give you a framework, they'll tell you, it might show you how to do it, but usually you're responsible for doing it. It's a huge deal. It's interesting because it might be one line item, a single bulleted line item on a set of assumptions in an SOW or proposal, but that one bulleted line item can have massive catastrophic effects on your project if you don't do it well. And by the way, you've got to budget time and money for that, and that is not in your vendor's plan. So Target's lesson is they didn't do that well. The data was bad. They couldn't get product in the right place at the right time. They actually ended up going out of business or pulling the plug on their operations in Canada. I think they've since gone back into Canada, if I'm remembering correctly. I think they're in Canada again now, but at that time they had to close stores because they didn't have the right data and the right visibility into their operations to be able to manage it well. Mo on TikTok says a client is not seeing the importance of defining the target operating model, but is only focused on a new ERP. Very true. Another term that's used to manipulate the industry or from the industry is lift and shift. I imagine that's part of where this comes from. If I can convince you that this is a lift and shift, I'm going to convince you my software is going to be easy to implement and that you don't need to worry about that fluffy stuff like target operating model and change management adoption. That's all just stuff we can deal with later if needed, but that's the stuff that will make or break your project. So very well said and great point there. Osmi on TikTok says, is it worth to go from on-prem to cloud? Does the cost justify? I don't know. It depends on your business case. The cost will be higher than you think. You will not save money by moving to the cloud. You're probably going to spend more money. The question is, can you justify the higher cost? Is it worth it? Do you get more business value out of it? It's another question your leaders should be asking. You shouldn't go to the cloud just because that's where the industry is going. That's the future. Because again, my prediction is that it will not be the future for long. I think the cloud will always exist, but I think the hybrid model of some on-prem, some cloud, somewhere in the middle is probably where we're going to settle. But right now, the vendors are pushing cloud hard as the future because that's the future of their profitability. That's where they're going to make the most money. So you have to take that with a grain of salt. Let's see. Let's look at some technology traps too. I haven't talked a lot about this. We did talk about how at Lidl, how there was a conflict between operational wants and needs and what the technology could or couldn't do. That you could argue is a technology trap or limitation. Some might say again, well, it wasn't really because it would have worked fine if Lidl would have just changed their processes. But that's debatable at best. I think that's questionable to assume that. And every company is going to have those sorts of trade-offs and decisions they need to make. So I don't think it's safe to say that you're just going to accept the software the way it's built to work. But another example is Waste Management versus SAP. This was a big lawsuit probably 15 years ago. It was a $500 million lawsuit, settled for, I believe, $77 million from what I have in public record. And the key here is that the demo selling and the sales cycle fraud playbook went to court. It was demoing functionality that didn't exist. There was allegations of fraud and misrepresentation, which I would tend to probably agree with in some ways, just based on what I've read about this case. But that's something that, again, you could say shame on the vendor for overselling their capabilities and showing a version of the software that didn't yet exist. They sold if I remember correctly, it was like a 36-month timeline that they put in their proposal, but there's no way a company that size was going to implement 3 years. I don't need to know anything more about them other than the name Waste Management to know that it's just not going to happen, especially knowing that they had 30 or 40 different locations, very diverse operations. So that's a case where they were sold a bill of goods, both in terms of the functionality and the timeline. And the product itself probably wasn't best suited for that company because they did have such diverse operations, and there was a need for flexibility, or a need for more flexibility than what SAP could offer. That was a big challenge. Here's one that this is probably the craziest story. I'll save this one for this will be my last one. I'm going to go to more audience questions here because there's a lot here. But the craziest story I have, single craziest story, and this is true. This was actually an expert witness case that we were called into, and I testified as an expert witness. This actually transcends, my whole thesis of the book of Welcome to the Machine. The whole thesis of this book is clients have their own dysfunctions, vendors have dysfunction, consultants have dysfunction, and all three together create a ton of dysfunction that lead to failure. Well, this one's interesting because it kind of spans across all of the above, because this particular customer, I can't mention names here, but they went out and hired I don't remember the exact title. It wasn't a CIO, but it was like a VP of transformation. It was going to be an internal person that would manage the entire digital transformation. So they hired this guy, and I think his salary was pretty decent. His salary is not important, but just to know it was pretty significant. It was like $300,000 or $400,000 US dollars for base salary, which is respectable, but very respectable, more than most people make. So he's making a good salary. He gets brought in to manage this transformation. He brings in a vendor that I won't mention by name. It's a vendor and the system integrator. He had, long story short, we found out through the discovery process, and this is why the suit happened, is the guy had a deal with his buddy's system integrator that he would get 10% of the revenue generated by his buddy's firm on this same project he was managing. So over the course of, I think it was like 3 years, this guy made his $300,000 or $400,000 base salary, but he made over, I think it was $1.1 million just in kickbacks from the company that he brought in to do the implementation. And again, if you're the guy that is doing the implementation and you can get someone to agree to, hey, I'm going to incentivize you, it's highly unethical. Don't get me wrong. It's highly unethical, but it gets the job done right. It's highly effective. Highly unethical, but highly effective. I don't know that it's illegal, which is bizarre that I don't know. I don't think it's illegal. You could argue, I think it's very, very unethical. It should be illegal, but it's not. So anyway, whether he was right or wrong, I'd say he's probably wrong, but that's debatable. The guy that, owned the system integrator company. So he gives his buddy the kickback. The guy makes a bunch of money. Long story short, he was making such irrational decisions. The guy that was internal to the company, he was making such irrational decisions that it was leading them to failure. I mean, he kept extending the timeline. He kept bringing on more resources from the system integrator, and it just amplified the conflict of interest that already existed with the system integrator and the vendor. Now it's became internal, to where your main internal guy that you trust to be your trusted advisor, the guy looking out for your best interests, now all of a sudden he's compromised as well because he's making money via kickbacks. And that's the only time I've seen it happen at that magnitude. But I do wonder, there's times where I come across clients and I do wonder, are you getting kickbacks because you're acting so irrationally in your decision making, and you're so blinded by the vendor Kool-Aid? I have to wonder, is someone offering you a kickback? Like, if you guys choose this software, I'll give you X. And I have no proof to back this other than to say I've seen it happen once at a pretty big scale. It went to litigation. I have to wonder if there's other instances of that in the industry. What do you guys think? I'd love to hear the audience feedback on this. Am I crazy? I tend to, I'll be the first to admit, I do tend to get fascinated by conspiracy theories. So I will always chase down conspiracy theories, even if I know they're not true, just because I'm fascinated by them. But I'd love to hear the feedback here from the audience. You think this is real? Alina on LinkedIn says cloud and value equals trap. Yeah. I mean, the cloud is a trap in a lot of ways, but if it adds value, enough value, and you can justify the risk of being locked in or making it very difficult to change, then perhaps it's not a terrible thing. But that's for you to decide. I mean, I think every company might come to different answers on that. And then Marcelo adds to what Alina said by saying, if you've been through as many cloud migrations as I've had to, you find out the cloud has you. That's a movie reference. Which movie is that? I don't know which movie that is. I feel like you're going to tell me and it's going to be super obvious, but I don't know what that is. The cloud has you. Someone help me out here. Who was that? Okay. Alina says, welcome to the jungle. Who did what? Should it be so interesting? Is it available on Amazon? Yes, it is. All three books, Welcome to the Machine, Welcome to the Jungle, and Final Countdown, are all available on Amazon. Final Countdown is the first book I wrote. You can barely see it over my shoulder. dark blue cover. It's more of a strategy book. It's about how to define a digital strategy and roadmap. Welcome to the Jungle is more case study based, so it unpacks public case studies and talks about why they failed and the decisions that led to the failure so that you can learn from them. And then Welcome to the Machine, which is the newest book, talks about the industry, the conflicts of interest, the way dysfunction works to create a systemic breakdown that causes failure. The systemic breakdown won't change anytime soon, I don't think, but if you understand it, you can navigate it better and make better decisions and be successful despite the machine's efforts to control and profit from you. Jumanji? Is that Jumanji? I'm not sure. James says, yes, up there at Jumanji. I'm not sure if that means that quote was from Jumanji or not.
Well, thank you very much for joining today. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Love to hear your feedback. Any stories you've got, leave them in the chat. I'm actually going to pull some of those stories for future episodes, so be sure to drop those in the chat, because I do want to do a part 2 of this thread and have it maybe as an ongoing series, because I do really like the storytelling angle here and the case study angle of it. And as always, be sure to check out my new book, Welcome to the Machine. Check out the QR code above. You can also go to the links below. Let me know what you think when you read it. Please leave me a review on Amazon too. If you have read it or if you bought it, it helps a lot if you leave a review. Be as honest, candid as you want to be, but the review itself matters more than getting a 5-star review necessarily, although 5-star reviews are awesome. I will not complain if you give me a 5-star review, but having a review of some sort is better than no review at all. So thank you in advance for doing that. We'll be back same time, same place next week. You want to see any old episodes of this podcast, any past episodes going all the way back to 2021, go to transformationgroundcontrol.com. That's the same site. You can see all the new episodes. You can also subscribe and listen and watch wherever you listen to or watch these podcasts. Hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next week on the next episode of Transformation Ground Control. Take care.